SD, fabulous. So thank you so much, Trevor, for doing that. And thank you both for being with us here. Denise was there, and wasn't that good, Denise? It was so good. So good. I'm sure they both will be just as good today. Okay, and we actually are also recording, though we got started a little late, but not everyone needs to hear me banter on for the rest of humanity's time. So we're gonna go ahead and get started, turning it over to Trevor and Corey. Corey, you are a co-host, so feel free to share your screen. Okay, and thank you both for being with us here today.
Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen. Mary, can you see that? Do I have it?
I can see that, yes, thank you.
Okay.
It's always that question, isn't it? You know, is it?
Yeah, it's like, is this working? Is anybody out there? Well, thank you everyone for the invitation to speak today. Mary has set a high bar for us. I hope we clear it. I'm excited to see so many people on a Saturday morning ready to talk about and listen to us talk about memorials. Normally Saturday morning is just me talking to my wife about whatever memorial I've been studying that week. So it's nice to have a much larger captive audience, and I'm sure she appreciates the break this weekend. Before I begin, I just wanted to say a real note of sincere thanks to Mary. She has been incredibly helpful to us in our research on this project, which, as I'll say in a moment, is part of a much larger book project that Dr. Dodman and I are working on right now. I think Mary knows, as she just indicated, I'm not an American historian by training. This is really my first endeavor into archival work in the United States. I'm much more familiar and comfortable in France and Germany, and Mary has been incredibly helpful with this process. Also, I must say, during a pandemic, allowing us to even pursue this kind of research and being willing to respond to research questions and allow us to keep this process moving with so many things closed. I also wanted to give a quick note of thanks to a student of both Dr. Dodman and me at Hood College, Kaylee Winpigler, who has been working since last summer as a research assistant and has done a phenomenal job, and without whose help we wouldn't be at this stage in the project. So our thanks to Kaylee Winpigler. Just a note of sort of context, what we're bringing to you today. We're really bringing a work in progress. We are in the early stages of a book project that explores local memories of the First World War, not just in the United States, but also in the United Kingdom and Germany and France. We're pursuing the process of local memory, the ways in which local communities remember the First World War, particularly during the interwar years from 1918 to 1939. We're interested in how local communities reflected on what was going on at the national level, what was going on in national capitals. In some cases, local communities didn't reflect much at all on what was going on in the national capitals. The local level is really a whole different experience to itself. But this is the path we're pursuing, and we'll say that Frederick is our case study for the United States, and so it will feature prominently in the book, as well as Winchester, England, where Dr. Dodman and I were last year, looking at every memorial we could get our hands on and ignoring news updates that kept saying there's a pandemic coming, there's a pandemic coming. We made it back safely, and it was a great trip. But we were in Winchester, England, which is our case study there. And then hoping that travel becomes possible again soon, we'll be studying Freiburg, Germany, and Orléans, France. And so the book will compare and situate these four cities and in this larger comparative context and exploration of local memory. What we have for you today, though, is sort of reflections on our research in progress on Frederick, which again, we're very grateful to the help of so many that have allowed us to even pursue this year with so many archives being closed. And so we'd like today to talk about layered memories, the Frederick County World War I Memorial in context. And we'll explain a bit what we mean by layered both in terms of physical space, but also in terms of this relationship between individual and local and national memories. So by way of introduction, I want to take us back to the unveiling of the Frederick County World War I Memorial in Memorial Park On November 11th, 1924, you can see the Frederick Post newspaper here from the 12th of November, the following day, which includes about 4 pages of, and I think 8 in that particular issue of coverage. This was a huge story, a big event in the city. The banner headline there, "Whole City joins an Armistice Day celebration." One of the things I think that is interesting to think about is that, you know, in 1924, when this memorial is unveiled, when the memorial construction process is finally completed, it's 6 years after the end of the First World War. And a lot has happened as Frederick, by the time Frederick comes together to celebrate this event. The US has had 2 new presidents. President Wilson has passed at this point. President Harding has also passed. President Coolidge is in the White House. The US has been through the influenza pandemic and is still dealing with it in many ways. With the Red Summer, dealing with a host of racial tensions and socioeconomic tensions coming out of the First World War. The conflict in Europe, in many ways, is just ending. It's just in 1924 that the Dawes Plan is bringing an end to the financial crises in Europe that attended the signing of the armistice and the Versailles settlement. American troops are just beginning to come home from Germany, from the occupation at this point, and there are soldiers from Frederick County who are involved in that occupation. And so in many ways, the war it seems like it's been over for a while, but for some families, it's still going on. And so I think as we go forward, one thing to just mention, to keep in mind here is this process. I mean, this memorial comes about 6 years after the fact, and there is a whole story behind it about how this memorial gets created and also about where it gets located. And I think those are really important things to consider as we reflect on this memorial, particularly as we come up on the memorial centennial itself. You know, a lot of World War I memorials were nearing their 100-year anniversary, and that raises a whole host of questions. What do we do with these sites of memory a century later? And we'll try to offer some answers to that. But as we work our way back then to this date, you've got 4,000 people at Memorial Park, all kinds of speeches being given. We want to set the stage now for the type of memory that has been pursued up until this point, both at the national and then at the local level. And so for some reflection on the national level, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Dodman.
That's great. Thank you, Dr. Campion. And let me echo Corey's remarks of thanks to Mary, to Kaylee, and to all of you for welcoming us here today to your space. And we're very excited about the presentation, and I hope you'll find it to be illuminating and interesting. So yeah, we're sort of moving a little further afield in order to move back again to try to have a little bit of a closer look at what's developing in DC, in the nation's capital, which I would add is also a locality for those people who live in DC. Day to day, they experience the place that they live, not merely as the nation's capital, which it is, of course, but also as their neighborhood or the place where they go for walks, head to work every day. So we'll be thinking about DC both as a place of national reckoning and remembering, but also as comprised of neighborhoods and places where regular people live and remember and forget the war or wars that we have in our past collectively. So we'll start at the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier, which was dedicated November 11th, 1921. Of course, there had been a kind of worldwide movement to dedicate unknown soldiers. The most famous examples of which had already happened in both England and in France, in Westminster Abbey and in the Arc de Triomphe underneath. And one of the most interesting things we think about the development of memory making, to borrow a phrase of Jay Winters, that it becomes both a site of memory and of mourning, is the idea of how layered a process this really is. It's a great example of the extent to which memorials are never static things. Even if they're cast in bronze and stone, they're always ever changing as time moves on. Of course, as you can see from the date, November 11th, 1921, we're actually at the centenary year of the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier, and there are a lot of events planned. Of course, the pandemic is impacting some of those, I would imagine. But if you're interested in learning more about what Arlington has on tap, you should go to the Arlington website. There's a whole page dedicated to events planned for the centenary of the dedication. But a couple highlights here. So it arrives with much pomp and circumstance on November 11th, 1921. But then over the years that followed this, the American Legion became increasingly concerned about irreverent behaviors of members of the public, picnicking, for instance, on the top of the Tomb of the Unknown, sleeping, using as a bench. And it's in 1926 that an honor guard is posted. And of course, that's one of the most familiar elements to this day. You know, we take students, Dr. Campion and I have taken numerous groups of students there. And if they're a first-time visitor and they've not seen the changing of the guard, they're in for quite an experience. It's a very moving, fascinating ceremony that's a constant there. But it's really interesting to think about the fact that 5 years unfolded when it wasn't a part of things. So 5 years later, the honor guard is put in place, and then it's a little bit beyond that, 1932, that the familiar sarcophagus is added. So again, this is just a way of helping us to see that memory making is a process, and it's constantly in flux. And Corey, could we go to the next slide? Because the other thing to add about the placement of the Tomb of the Unknown, of course, is that it's just on the other side of the Memorial Amphitheater, which had been kind of authorized in 1915, during the war years, of course, before the US entered the war in 1917, but it was only very recently completed itself, 1920. You can see some quotes here that are included. In the Memorial Amphitheater, I would add, remembers, memorializes American battles from the Revolutionary War forward to the Spanish-American War, does not include anything about World War I. So the World War I memory component is sort of added to the front side of that, the chapel, the apse you can see at the sort of top side of that slide, and the Tomb of the Unknown is directly below that. It's kind of like a chapel-like structure. There's a museum in there with quite an interesting exhibit. Last time we were there, quite an interesting permanent exhibit. So you get quotes from Washington and Lincoln, and of course, one from the classical era, Dulce et decorum est pro patria mori. By the time this is included as an inscription in 1920, many World War I aficionados will know that this is Wilfred Owen's most famous poem. Of course, he doesn't invent the phrasing. That's Horace from way back when. It's unlikely that Owen's poem, I think Sassoon brings out this posthumous edition of his poems sometime in 1920. It's unlikely that there's an overlap there, but for visitors today who know Owen's poem, you can't help but read that line, "It is sweet and fitting to die for one's country," with all of the backstory that we know about Owen's suffering in the First World War, not to mention his untimely death with only a few days before the armistice. Okay, Corey, could we get to the next slide? So thinking about the kind of conjunction of the Tomb of the Unknown sort of attached to, or proximal to, the Memorial Amphitheater, which looks back on the whole history of American conflict, is to remind us that the Civil War itself, just to take up one of those conflicts, is very much a matter that's kind of still being processed by Americans at the time. So post-war years, 1918 to 1924 is really what we're focusing on here. With 1924 is the year of the dedication of Frederick's Memorial. But in the nation's capital, the Grant Memorial is only finalized in 24. The Lincoln finalized in 22. I have a slide here of what's come to be known as the Peace Monument. It's quite close to the Capitol, very close to the Grant Memorial, actually. And it's here in part because it's an interesting curiosity. It was never formally dedicated. It was intended actually for Annapolis. It's got a number of really interesting sculptural elements. On the bottom, there's sculptures of Neptune and Mars, and then Peace and Victory, female figures. And the two that you see at the top here, bottom left on the slide, is a female figure at left, known variously sometimes as Grief or America, and then the robed figure of History there, holding a tablet, presumably to inscribe the names of the dead. It was meant originally, it was designed to honor the Union naval dead. Again, as I mentioned, intended for Annapolis, but it ends up in the nation's capital. And it's important to note here because, and Corey, could we go to the next slide? The dedication of the 1st Division Monument, which comes about in 1924, the parade route, a Washington Post article from the period alerted me to this in some research, recent research into the 1st Division Monument. The parade starts at that Peace Memorial in front of the US Capitol. So the parade route begins at this monument that is originally intended to honor the Union naval dead, which is kind of collectively then kind of taken on the sort of the trappings of the Peace Monument. And we move from the Peace Monument then to the 1st Division Monument, which is, you know, famous for this gold leaf figure on top. But it also has inscribed in bronze on the panels on either side at the bottom the names of 6,000 individuals from the 1st Division who died in the First World War. 1931 brings about, if you've been to the mall, you'll probably be familiar with this, although it's a little bit off the beaten path. It's quite close to the Martin Luther King Jr. Memorial. The DC War Memorial was put up and dedicated in 31. Seeing that it's on the mall, you know, students often will sort of say, oh, well, that must be the National World War I Memorial. And of course, what we know about it is that it's not, in fact, it's dedicated to those who served, those from DC who served. And it stands as a really neat exemplar of the sort of memorial that there were two schools of thought at the time, well, at least two, but two dominant ones. One, that memorials should be functional, should be useful and practical, not merely to serve memorial purposes, but also to be useful to the people who follow in the wake of those who served and died. So this bandstand memorial did, you know, function as such for concerts, for weddings and other kinds of gatherings. Whereas the 1st Division Monument is clearly something sculptural and symbolic and serves, you know, of course it provides a center for gatherings, but it doesn't serve, it doesn't have a use function in the same way that the DC War Memorial does. So another sort of example that stands akin to the 1st Division Monument is the 2nd Division Memorial, which is put up a little bit later in 36. The flaming sword there, so if you've driven along, I guess what is it, Constitution Avenue there? If you've driven along there, you'll see this really remarkable flaming sword, which is meant to evoke the 2nd Division's defense of Paris. Again, another memorial that is sort of symbolic in nature. It's also a good example, and we'll see another local version of this, whereby World War I inscriptions are then added to the World War I inscriptions over time are the dates of other conflicts. I live in Middletown, Maryland, and the Middletown World War I Memorial is a good example of, you know, you've probably seen this, you know, if you've been to some small towns, you'll see like on one side of the memorial will be the World War I names, but then on the back side of the memorial are the World War II names. So the 2nd Division Memorial is an example of that kind of repurposing, ever evolving marking of memory from conflict to conflict. Next slide, Corey. We're still in DC here in a sort of another area. Pershing Park has a really convoluted, pretty strange, frankly, history that we don't have time really to do justice, but a couple of notes about it, that there's really a push in the 30s to honor Pershing, who was the the commander of the American Expeditionary Force. It finally gets dedicated in 81, 50 years later. Corey and I have taken students there, and sadly, it over the years, it's fallen into quite a bit of disrepair. But there's been a congressional approval for finally for a National World War I memorial, and it's totally being redone there. You can see some of the design plans at right, which will shift American memories of World War I away from a kind of quite old-fashioned great man of history approach you can see encapsulated in the Pershing statue to a much more an exploration of collectivities, what it meant for many Americans to go to war, average Americans. So we don't know exactly when that work will be finished. It's ongoing. Corey, I think you told me one day that there's some kind of camera, like a live stream.
Yes, if you just type in National World War I Memorial, you'll be taken to their site, and there's a live construction cam. You can watch it being built, and if you're into that sort of thing, we are. It's kind of cool to watch.
Yeah. Okay, next slide. Mm-hmm. So if you're wondering, okay, it seems maybe a little strange that there's no National World War I Memorial on the mall or nearby until 2006 or 2016 when Pershing Park gets authorized to be totally redone. Well, does the U.S. have one? Well, so the story takes us temporarily even further afield to Kansas City, where the Liberty Memorial was dedicated in 26 and has since 2006 come to function as what's known as the National World War I Museum and Memorial. And Corey's hometown is Kansas City, so I wonder if he might just say a couple words about this. It's on my long list of cool World War I places that I want to go. I've not been, but I know Corey has, so he might be able to share insights here that would be better than me just kind of making it up.
Yeah, I mean, it's a fascinating memorial. It draws both presidential sanction as well as visits from all of the major Allied military commanders at its dedication in 26. But it really just begins as a result of a series of local fundraising efforts in Kansas City to create a memorial there, but very quickly becomes one of the first memorials. And I think, for reasons that maybe we can talk about in the Q&A if there's interest, there's a lot of concern on the part of national US politicians and government officials to control the memorial process. And I think this was the first real memorial project that began to take shape in the country. And so, DC officials sort of jump on this bandwagon as a way to kind of make this the memorial and help shape and craft that narrative, because there were a lot of anxieties about what the memorial landscape would say about the war. And so it becomes this very prominent local but quasi-national memorial that now is one of the great sites in Kansas City. When the Royals finally won the World Series a few years back, everything around it was blue. There was a giant parade, but beneath it, there's also a fascinating museum to the First World War. Just one quick anecdote: when you walk in, you're actually walking in on a glass floor over a series of models of trenches from the Western Front, and there are poppies everywhere below you, and the poppies represent a certain number of soldiers who passed away. The room is completely dark above you except for being lit below you, and it really is a very moving experience. It's one of the most moving, sort of interactive, if you will, exhibits that I've seen, and that's become part of that memorial. So yeah.
Great, thank you, Corey. So next slide. So from Kansas City, we'll jet back this way to Baltimore, because it may be occurring to you to wonder, okay, this is how things are happening in the nation's capital and out in Kansas City. What are Marylanders doing at the state level to remember World War I? So it's worth stopping here before we get much more local. The War Memorial in Baltimore was dedicated in 1925. If you've been to downtown Baltimore, it's across from City Hall. It's a stunning building. It's beautiful both on the outside and on the inside. And it also, as you can see from the Memorial Hall photo in bottom left, it's a functional memorial. It was designed with both memorial intentions, but also the practical considerations of wanting to have civic space, gathering space for not merely veterans, although veterans groups were prominent in the minds of the designers, but spaces for meetings and concerts and other kinds of functions. The interior of that memorial hall has a panel dedicated to each of the counties of Maryland and a list of the dead, which are given here in according to rank. And yeah, it's the kind of place that when you enter into it, I was there, well, I've been there a couple of times. Once I had my youngest son with me. He was, I think, about 4 or 5 at the time. It was just the two of us wandering around in there. And it was really, it's both a sort of somber space, of course, you know, to encounter the names of so many dead from Maryland, but it also does have not a celebratory, but I would say a kind of respectful atmosphere, one that, you know, illuminates the names, holds them up for all of us to sort of consider for posterity. And yeah, I think it's important to reckon with the fact that this memorial hall and the War Memorial in Baltimore is happening, you know, kind of coterminous with, you know, the all of what we'll encounter in Dr. Campion's remarks to follow on the local scene. So we have this ever evolving, you know, way of remembering in the nation's capital, you know, that's running sort of in lockstep with efforts in Baltimore to remember the state's dead. And then, you know, what we'll find is this sort of really variegated picture of memory making from community to community in Frederick County, and then at the county level. All of this is kind of happening all at the same time. And I think the slides that follow will really highlight that process.
Okay, thanks, Dr. Dodman. Yeah, as we arrive in Frederick now, I think one of the things we want you to take away is that as you approach the First World War Memorial in Frederick, it really does make sense to have in mind these other memorial landscapes, both the state memorial landscape that was created around the same time, but also the national memorial landscape. I'll be honest with you, having spent the last year pouring through the Frederick Post and other papers following the story of this memorial, there isn't actually a lot of reflection going on in Frederick about the national memorial landscape. But I don't think that means that the national memorial landscape is irrelevant. I think what that tells us is something quite important about the process of local memory and about the First World War in particular. This has always been, and many scholars have said this more eloquently than I can, it's always been a difficult story for the United States to get its head around. It's a hard narrative to write. It does not write itself in the way that it does in Germany and France and the UK and other countries. And I think that's partly why we see such a disparate and diverse and disconnected set of national, state, and local memorial landscapes, is because everyone had a slightly different understanding of what this war meant. And this is certainly the case in Frederick. In Frederick, what we've really come to recognize is that it really, I think the best way to approach the memorial in Memorial Park today is to do it by way of understanding the other major memorials that had already been built in Frederick at the time. As much as Dr. Dodman and I are loath to admit it, we know that not everybody actually cares about memorials, right? Not everyone in Frederick was following this stuff on bated breath, but to the community involved in designing, contributing money to adding commentary on the First World War memorial, the local memorial landscape was absolutely the first point of reference. And I want to illustrate that for you in just a moment. But I want to start off just with a kind of quick review of it. By the end of the First World War, where are Frederick's major sites of memory and sites of mourning, to again borrow from the famous memorial scholar, Jay Winter. I think memory always begins with an individual process, particularly when we're talking about death. It begins with a grave, it begins with cemeteries. And so probably the most famous cemetery in Frederick, Mount Olivet here, dedicated in 1854, But this is interesting because Mount Olivet also brings us to this notion of sort of layers of memory. I mean, Mount Olivet marks kind of the second edition of a whole host of churchyard cemeteries that had been reaching their capacity and were going to reach their capacity as Frederick's population was growing in the 19th century. And so the decision is made to create a new, larger cemetery on a 32-acre plot, which of course is the cemetery that we have today. And there are any number of reinterments, that is, graves that are moved from one older cemetery to Mount Olivet. And this is a theme that we see throughout Frederick. And Mount Olivet plays a primary role in the early commemorative ceremonies in Frederick after the war. Of course, Mount Olivet is largely, in fact, entirely, with only one exception I can think of, a white cemetery. Frederick's African-American population had separate burial grounds, and several of them over the years. The Laboring Son Cemetery, whose origins date back to 1837, but had really fallen into disarray and was not a site of current burials by the end of the First World War. By the way, I should note that this was a burial ground for the relatively small free African-American population in Frederick, not for the enslaved population, many of whom tragically found unmarked graves on plantations and things. Greenmount Cemetery, another African-American cemetery, which you may be familiar with the story of this. It became sort of a big deal with the most recent expansion of the hospital, which essentially built right over the top of an African-American cemetery, which goes back to the 1880s. There's now a plaque there marking where the cemetery used to be. But again, the sort of erasure of memory here as these cemeteries are built over, which is also a theme we'll see with the memorial itself. And then Fairview Cemetery, which opens in 1923, and actually is the site of reinterment of a number of graves from Greenmount, as that cemetery stopped taking burials as the hospital was expanding. So there's a diverse burial landscape in Frederick, which very much reflects the racial tensions of the period and the area's history through the Civil War. But these were primary sites of mourning for individuals, for families, which I should note, individual mourning itself took some time after the First World War. It's only in the spring of 1920 that the US government finally reaches a deal with the French government to actually allow the removal of bodies from battlefields in France and for their return to the United States. So many families, as they began to learn of the death of their loved ones, sometimes weeks and months after the official end of the war, they had to wait even longer until there could actually be a burial. About 70% of American families elected to have their loved ones' remains returned home. The rest remain on battlefield cemeteries in Europe, which is a whole nother talk, but a fascinating component of this story. Beyond this, there are a number of monuments that are put up in the years preceding the First World War and become points of reference in the process of building the First World War memorial. One of the oldest of these is the memorial to the Confederate soldiers, the unknown soldiers at Mount Olivet Cemetery, erected in 1880. As you can see by the Ladies Monumental Association of Frederick County, in honor of the soldiers of the Confederate Army who fell in the battles of Antietam, Monocacy, and elsewhere. Are buried here. This is a memorial that draws our attention immediately to Frederick's, what shall we say, difficult relationship with its past by the 1880s, still very much divided by the Civil War. And you'll see this as we look at the memorial landscape that people in 1918 would have known. You can very much see this division still there, and it's reflected in the memorial itself. Courthouse Square is another important point in our story of the First World War Memorial. One of the things that really strikes me, if you read the speeches from the day of dedication for the First World War Memorial, they really talk more than the memorial itself or what the First World War meant. They're all talking about place. They're all talking about where the memorial is, and everybody mentions the fact that the memorial was supposed to be here. This is where the major community leaders and many of the donors for the memorial wanted the memorial to be, but of course it doesn't make it there. part it doesn't make it there because of the Clark Fountain, which goes back to the late 19th century and was a gift of sorts to the city, to the residents, by James C. Clark, who gains his title not from the military, but from service in the railway. The Post reports that this fountain was a sort of peace offering. There had been a real tension around this square, whether or not it was fenced off. At one point, there's animals grazing through here, and so there's the real questions about access and who should get to use this prominent spot. And so Clark donates this fountain and tries to create this public space that is there for everyone. And this fountain becomes a real sticking point, as you're going to see in a minute, with the First World War Memorial. Another important point on our story is the North Market Street fountain, which goes back to the 1890s. This is a sort of gift from the city to the city. It's created with public subscription, goes up in the 1890s, and this is another potential site for the First World War Memorial, which actually had quite a bit of support from the public. But as you all know, I guess I don't have to worry about spoiling the plot. This isn't where the memorial is. But an important site nevertheless. If there's a memorial experience and model that sets the stage for what happens with Frederick's attempts to commemorate the First World War, it's the Francis Scott Key Memorial, which is dedicated in 1898 in Mount Olivet Cemetery. You know, this huge full front page coverage of this dedication. It marks the end of really a decade worth of work to try and bring something about to mark Francis Scott Key's connection to Frederick. And this memorial really, in many ways, this gives us a second theme in Frederick's memorial landscape. On the one hand, you have the enduring divisions of the Civil War, and in particular, monuments and commemorative activities recalling the Confederacy and Confederate soldiers. And on the other hand, you have emphasis on figures like Francis Scott Key and Barbara Fritchie, which are very much trying to situate Frederick firmly within the Union, firmly within American patriotism, firmly embedded in what by 1898 is a growing American empire. And I want to read you just one quote from one of the dedication ceremonies from this day, because this really gives us this feel of this kind of what I'm increasingly calling the patriotic narrative in the local memorial landscape. So about the Francis Scott Key Memorial, the speaker says, "But now 'tis done, we believe well done. The ashes of Key rest marked and protected. The hand of Maryland stretches across the continent to the hand of California, where too Key's name is writ in lasting stone, and the two clasp. North and South join theirs. The bond is completed, the circle of the country perfected. Never will it be broken, for Maryland binds it fast with the Star-Spangled Banner." Maryland is the linchpin of the Union here. I mean, Maryland is now suddenly in this speech and in this memorial landscape, there's no Civil War division. Maryland is firmly within the Union, and it's one of the key sites holding this together because of Francis Scott Key, because of the birth of the national anthem, the Star-Spangled Banner. This is the memorial that people point to in 1918 when they start trying to design the First World War Memorial. The fundraising campaign, the hiring of a private sculptor. It's sculpted by a gentleman named Capini, an Italian sculptor, not unlike the First World War Memorial. I mean, this is the model that they really point to in 1918, and this is what they're trying to echo or to communicate with in the design of the First World War Memorial. Another site that's important is the Armory, which was built in 1913, just before the war. And this will, of course, be the site of the American Legion headquarters, which plays such a huge role in the design of the memorial itself. And it sits right across the street from where the memorial eventually is placed. As the First World War begins in 1914, it's something that Frederick is reading about every day, absolutely every day in the newspapers. If America is not involved, it's still following it with great interest. But the process of remembering this divided past continues. And this marker to the Southern soldiers is dedicated in 1914 on the Monocacy battlefield. There had also been, in years prior, memorials erected to state regiments from Vermont and Pennsylvania, and I believe New Jersey between 1905 and 1915. So it's again a sort of contested memorial landscape, but evidence that the Civil War is still influencing the city's reflections on the past. 1914 as well, you get Barbara Fritchie's memorial, which again is very much a kind of union-focused, patriotic-focused space. And so, you know, another point of reference here. So how does all of these references, how does this landscape of memorials, where do we put the First World War? And that really is the question that people grappled with in the city and then the county from 1918 all the way through 1924. What do we say about the First World War? Where do we say it? And what do we do with it? There were all kinds of crazy ideas. I say crazy, hopefully you'll agree with me. In 1918, one of the calls was for a captured German cannon. Maybe that's not so crazy, that's common. There was another local official who called for Kaiser Wilhelm II's scalp to be brought to Frederick and be part of the memorial. In addition, there are calls for parks and statues and trees they're sort of all over the place. But very quickly what happens is, you know, the memorial effort comes under the guidance of the women's section of the county's Wartime Council of National Defense. The chairwoman was Frances H. Markle, and it begins meeting in late November of 1918 and cites immediately Francis Scott Key's memorial as the model for how to not only design a memorial, but to pursue this process of acquiring money and hiring a sculptor and dedicating a site of memory. By February of 1919, the county's first significant memorial campaign is squarely in what Dr. Dodman was talking about, the kind of functional memorial camp. The idea was to build some sort of park, and this was supposed to be a tax-funded memorial park. The Frederick Post, as you begin to read coverage of this story, you try to give them the benefit of the doubt. Maybe they're being unbiased, but by the time you get to the time that the county votes on this, it's clear that the paper really wants this to happen. Almost every day they run a new quote from some business leader, some prominent official saying that the county really needs this park, that this is something that's great for the soldiers. What's interesting is several months into the campaign to, excuse me, the campaign to earn money for this, they're not even mentioning the soldiers anymore. Now it's what Frederick's children need, and it would be a great place to play baseball, how does all of this end? In July of 1920, the park plan is defeated by a margin of 9-1. The exit polls, all the analysts said that the no vote was not that they didn't want to remember the First World War, it's that there was a concern with the already high tax burden. But the Frederick Post mentioned, sort of gave voice to a worry that was real at the time. It's 1920, there's no memorial. The only plan they had really had been defeated. And there was a fear that people were beginning to move on and that maybe there wouldn't be a memorial at all. In the meantime, there are other commemorative efforts that take place, memorial trees like this one that you see downtown near Baker Park. There are other groves that are planted around. Schley Park on sort of between downtown and Hood College is suggested as a memorial park at times, but there's a whole debate over who's going to mow the lawn there. And so that project sort of falls apart. And slowly but surely then, the American Legion, which is founded in 1919, starts to get involved, really nervous that city officials, county officials are gonna miss this opportunity to create a memorial. And they really start trying to pursue their own plans to erect a traditional statue memorial. And it's at that time that county officials decide to create a new memorial committee to pursue a public campaign for a traditional World War memorial. The American Legion agrees to stand down and just hold off for a second and let the county pursue this new memorial. And so they create a new committee in 1921. Judge Hammond Erner is the president. Joseph Henry Apple is the head of the design committee. There's a number of other prominent officials on fundraising committees. In short order, they start selecting sculptors and trying to fundraise. In the meantime, though, what happens is the county and the city start to move on. One of the first World War I memorials in the area actually goes up here at the Evangelical Reformed Church. There is a plaque that's dedicated members of the parish who died just at the time that the memorial committee is sort of reconstituting itself. And we're going to see this happen. There are other memorials that go up in Fairmont, in Middletown. People begin to move on and to commemorate the war in their own ways as this process of designing a formal memorial continues. Eventually, the Memorial Committee, though, hires in March of 1922 their designer, Giuseppe Moretti. His design was selected from among 16 submissions. And Dr. Dodman will say just a little bit about Moretti. He's a fairly prominent sculptor in the area.
He is certainly. So he's born in Italy in 57, dies in Italy in 35. In between, he leads a really colorful life. He's sort of all over the place. For the first 30 years or so, he's training and sculpting in Europe. Then he comes to the US, and he's based at various times in New York City, Alabama, Pittsburgh, and is probably most famous to this day for this gigantic Vulcan statue that he worked on for the St. Louis World's Fair in 1904. But over the course of his sculpting career, he produced dozens and dozens and dozens of sculptures, including 97 sculptures for, I think that like the National Theater in Havana, Cuba. But what you're seeing on screen right now are just a sampling of some of the World War I memorials that Moretti worked on in the years prior to or overlapping with his involvement with the Frederick Committee. Just a couple things. So this Indica Johnson Workers Memorial from 1920, the Indica Johnson company, the factory, was responsible for making all of the boots for American troops in the First World War. And it's a really, really fascinating memorial with all kinds of different elements. It's a bit of a hodgepodge. Actually, research tells us that, in fact, the factory owner, placed a lot of demands on Moretti about all the different elements that need to be included here. So you have this kind of robed female figure of peace on the very top. The next level sort of involves a representative of all the branches of the military. And then the inset photo you can see here on either side of this plaque are a female agricultural worker and a male shop worker. So you get a sense of the uniqueness of this memorial insofar as it's not just a memorial for military service, but it's also recognizing home front service and both men and women involved in the work that helps on the home front to fuel the war effort abroad. At the top of the screen on the left, you see Hygieia, goddess of health. This was put up in 1922 in Schenley Park in Pittsburgh. And there are some echoes with our Frederick County Memorial, as you can see, also, of course, echoing with the figure of the Statue of Liberty. In this figure of Hygieia, you see the staff of caduceus in her left hand. And then at the right side of the screen, the Firefighters Memorial Monument, which is in Harrisburg, right along the river, put up in 24. When you get closer to it, you get a sense for what Moretti is up to. It's a kind of like melding of firefighter gear and combat gear from the period. But then as you get right up close, you can see bottom right, this firefighter soldier figure is cradling a child in his arm beneath his cloak. I think it's very moving and quite unusual, actually. I don't know that I've seen another memorial quite like it, frankly. Both for its sort of heroic sort of male posture, but also the tenderness with which this figure is carrying this child is really quite remarkable. Corey, you could go to the next slide.
Yeah. Okay, so the committee hires Moretti. He begins working on finalizing his design, and the fundraising campaign begins. I have to say, as you read through the story in detail, it becomes a bit comical. Moretti is okay working on this and getting payments in installments, and the committee keeps saying, no, we want to get all of the money. first. So just give us a little bit more time. But the fundraising effort takes quite a while. Donations are slow to come in. And I think that's in part why this takes so long to create. But as Moretti is working away, as the donation campaign is underway, the real debate began over where to put this memorial. Everybody wanted, not everybody, but most of the memorial committee wanted this located in Courthouse Square. There are 2 judges on the committee, and I like to think they wanted this thing outside of their out of their offices, right downtown. But of course, there's that problem of the pesky Clark Fountain and a number of residents that didn't want the thing moved. What is it we're supposed to do with this? And so there's this back and forth. What about North Market Street? What if we put it up there where the fountain is? Finally, eventually, the committee hires a landscape architect who does a big study in late 23 saying, well, you know, let's look at the pros and cons of each location. And the long and the short of it is his conclusion is, yeah, it should go in Courthouse Square. You should move the fountain. That requires permission from county officials. And I won't bore you with the details, but basically the county punts on the issue. They don't say, no, we won't move the fountain. They don't say you don't have permission to move the fountain. They just refuse to take up the question. Because this is a really sticky issue. And so what we're faced with here is in late 23, the granite base, by the way, which comes to us from a quarry in Vermont, actually arrives in Frederick and is just sitting around in different locations. Moretti is writing the committee saying, your memorial is almost done, where is this going? Moretti himself actually comes to Frederick and says, yeah, it should go in front of the courthouse, which doesn't really help things. So they really don't know what to do. Enter the American Legion. Who decided upon, proposed this idea that what about putting it in the Evangelical Reformed Church burial ground, which is what we now know as Memorial Park. And so the American Legion and the county officials and the memorial committee approached the church about using this burial ground as a site for the memorial, which would of course require the reinterment of graves, many of which are actually moved to Mount Olivet, but many of which are not. Many of them are left and are still beneath the park. And there's a plaque here, which you can see listing the names of the graves that are there, though it's pretty clear that probably not all of the names of people who are buried there are actually listed on that plaque. And this is where I think the title of our talk comes in. The Memorial Park, it really makes sense to look at it as a park. Not just the First World War memorial, but you also have to consider the location. This is a memorial that is placed on top of a cemetery, which included the graves of some of Frederick's founding families. This is a war that the community and the country are struggling to determine its importance and its narrative, yet where people end up selecting to put it is one of Frederick's oldest sites of memory. I mean, they build it literally right on top of it. And so I think when you talk about the First World War Memorial in Frederick, to me, this is the image that I hope would come to mind. It's both the location and the statue itself, because it's really, they really go hand in hand. As they're working on the memorial, by the way, other county memorials continue to go up. November of 1922 is the first official memorial in the county, this one dedicated in Thurmont. The plaque here is back here under this gazebo today, which has since added World War II and other conflicts on top of it. The Francis Scott Key Hotel opening in 23. It has it is the site of a number of American Legion events because there's no memorial, there's no other place for people to gather. And so the American Legion starts using the hotel. There's actually a room dedicated in the hotel to the 29th Division, which had a lot of soldiers from Frederick County in it. The Middletown Hall, Memorial Hall, opens in 1923, and actually the Company A of the 115th Regiment, the Frederick Division, actually has a number of ceremonies and of gatherings here, in part because there's no memorial yet for the county. I mean, it's 23 and there's still no major site of memory, and so Middletown becomes this point of gathering. And then of course Middletown has its own marker that's added in 24, listing the names of soldiers from Middletown. the year that the memorial gets ready to be dedicated in 24, Frederick continues to commemorate other things. There's a memorial plaque that's put on Kemp Hall in 1924 ahead of the World War I memorial unveiling, marking the site where the Maryland legislature met and voted against secession during the Civil War. We don't have time to go into it, but if you have not visited this plaque, you should. When you read the text, it's really quite complicated, and it gives you a sense of how divided the history was. It's not readily clear that it's a good thing to the authors of this plaque that Maryland voted against secession. But it also seems to be suggesting that this is a point of pride. And so very much here you still see this divided narrative from the Civil War still coming through in the memorial landscape in 24. The memorial is dedicated then in November of 24. And what Moretti comes up with is a victory statue at the top here. This is really unique. The Memorial Committee did not want to go with one of the mass-produced doughboy statues that were very common across the United States. They wanted something that was unique, and Moretti does that. Here, a statue of victory, looking to the rising sun, extending the olive branch to Europe. The sword in the left arm is present. But it's sort of sheathed, it's retracted, it's not in use. The hope there is that peace will endure, but of course the United States, now having established itself as a major global military power, would be ready to go to war if it needed to happen again. Beneath the statue, and I have to add that the granite pedestal set for a time in the cemetery in the fall of 24 as the exhumations were taking place. So for a time, you had this sort of dual memorial landscape that kind of previewed what was coming, but also was still grappling with what was already there. In its design on the panels, the memorial is what Dr. Dodman and I often think of as both regressive and progressive. On the one hand, the memorial is quite progressive for the time relative to other monuments in the region and the country, in that it lists the name of women who served, one of whom is Miriam Apple, who you see pictured here, the daughter of Joseph Henry Apple, which of course has ties to Hood College, where Dr. Dodman and I teach. That is unique among a lot of First World War memorials, local memorials in particular, to see women mentioned. But it is also regressive. It is also echoing the realities of the Jim Crow era, in that it is segregated. It sets apart the names of African-American soldiers who served from Frederick County on its own panel. And that's one panel that you see on the right there, a memorial, and then the other panels going around are the names of non-African-American, predominantly white soldiers. It also has then the inscription on it, at the going down of the sun and in the morning we shall remember them, which is a line from a famous poem of the period that we'll say something about in just a moment here. Just to give you a close-up of the memorial itself, I think if you think about it, maybe some of you have been to Harrisburg and seen the Firefighters Memorial. I mean, clearly you can see Moretti's style here. The face is actually quite similar to what you see in Harrisburg. And then the inscription here, this monument was erected in honor of the sons and daughters of Frederick County who served their country in the Great World War, 1917 to 1918. These died for their country. And then the Binion quote. We'll change the slide here. Before we say something about the Binion quote, I just wanted to sort of bring it back to the idea of location here. You know, this thing sits on top of an already existing memorial ground in Frederick, which I think is both in some ways quite moving, that they were willing to give the First World War that sort of place of prominence. But it also complicates what that memorial site is doing. I mean, it's both remembering, but also in many ways erasing what is beneath that ground. And again, everybody in the dedication speeches on November 11th, 1924 talked about the fact that this should have been in the courthouse square, but it wasn't. It ended up here for the reasons that we've outlined. It has since then become sort of taken for granted. That's Memorial Park, memorials to Korea, Vietnam, World War II, and other events and conflicts are there now. But this was a really contentious place that was only designed and reached in reference to and in reflection on the other memorials that were in Frederick at the time. But I'll just close with a note from Dr. Dodman on the poem, because it's also quite moving. And if you go there, you may not necessarily know the reference, but it's worth knowing.
Yeah, I agree, Dr. Campion. So Binion is an English poet and scholar who was too old to volunteer and serve in a combat duty, but did serve in the Red Cross. This is a poem that came out in September of 1914. So it's a very, very early World War I poem. This particular inscription, it's really the whole fourth stanza that's quite famous. In fact, Derek Boorman's great study of British World War I memorials is entitled "At the Going Down of the Sun." This is an inscription that's found on countless World War I memorials throughout English-speaking countries. I'm from Canada. It has a place in the Canadian memorial landscape, American memorials, British memorials, Anzac memorials, New Zealander and Australian memorials often include this particular phrasing from Binion. It's also just, some of you may have seen this fairly new documentary film by the Lord of the Rings guy, Peter Jackson, came up in 2018, They Shall Not Grow Old, which does a number of really quite technologically amazing things with World War I era footage. It's certainly worth checking out. But this particular poem choice is interesting. This is an American memorial, right? And they choose this English poet for the inscription. But I'm going to read the poem aloud as a way of concluding. But I think there's probably ways that you can imagine why for many at the time, this poem carried with it a great deal of consolatory power. So we'll conclude with these words from Binion. The title of the poem is For the Fallen. With proud thanksgiving, a mother for her children, England mourns for her dead across the sea. Flesh of her flesh they were, spirit of her spirit, fallen in the cause of the free. Solemn the drums thrill, death august and royal sings sorrow up into immortal spheres. There is music in the midst of desolation, and a glory that shines upon our tears. They went with songs to the battle. They were young, straight of limb, true of eye, steady and aglow. They were staunch to the end against odds uncounted. They fell with their faces to the foe. They shall grow not old, as we that are left grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. At the going down of the sun, and in the morning, we will remember them. They mingle not with their laughing comrades again. They sit no more at familiar tables of home. They have no lot in our labor of the daytime. They sleep beyond England's foam. But where our desires are and our hopes profound, felt as a wellspring that is hidden from sight, to the innermost heart of their own land they are known, as the stars are known to the night. As the stars that shall, oops, sorry, someone's chat comment popped right up, and here we go. As the stars that shall be bright when we are dust, moving in marches upon the heavenly plain, as the stars that are starry in the time of our darkness, to the end they remain.
Okay, that's our presentation.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks. I'm going to stop sharing.
Yes. Thank you. I was trying to see how I could do that, but I couldn't.
Okay.
Thank you both so very, very, very much. We do have a number of questions, which I'm going to go ahead and attempt to interpret, or not interpret, but to present to you all. The first was from Kathleen, and people please continue to put questions in the chat, and people whose questions I'm asking, please feel free to also elaborate in the chat if I do not present this correctly. But from Kathleen, how are these memorials different from war victory monuments in centuries past or in antiquity?
That's a good question. One that we could go on forever, but I'll try not to. I think what's interesting here is these memorials It is a statue of victory, but it also lists the names of those who served and those who died. It's a celebration, but it's also an act of mourning. It is unique. This is something you see more in the American context than you see overseas, and that it includes the names of those who served. It isn't just those who died. Part of that, I think, is this growing sense, divided as it is by issues of race and gender and socioeconomic tensions. There is a sense of creating an American army, creating a sense of an American identity out of this war. And so I think that's part of what's behind recognizing not only those who died, but also those who served. But this isn't just, you know, in the ancient period, the names aren't listed. I mean, this is something that really comes about in the modern period with the advent of nationalism, and you really see takeoff with the First World War. So this, I think, is kind of doing double duty. It's both victorious, but it's also mourning.
The only thing I would add to that would be, it seems to me that what we get in Moretti's victory here, you know, it echoes back to, you know, something as old and ancient as Nike, you know, Samothrace.
Yeah.
But, you know, then sort of coupled with, you know, this sort of echoing with the Statue of Liberty in the American context. And then, yeah, as Corey mentioned, it's not merely this sort of allegorical or symbolic figure, but it's very much tied to the specific individuals who fought, served, lost their lives. So it both has a foothold in the very ancient, you know, shared collective past, but also it is really quite, you know, quite a new development. You know, the listing of the individual names, that was not something that prior conflicts made a point of doing.
Yeah.
Thank you. I know I have had researchers who've been confused by that, because I think the assumption even today is that it's just the dead people. And I'll have people come and say, did all those people die? So it's something that's confusing, I think, to some people. So good, because thank you.
Sure.
So that Carrie doesn't have to run across the room with Terry's question, though she just did, so never mind. I'm going to go right to Terry's question, but I'll still go to Terry's question. Gentleman from Terry, who does a lot of World War I research, I'd like to add. Are you including Frederick's African Americans perspective in your research project?
Go ahead.
In a word, yes, but it's you know, it's work that's in progress. So our vision would be, so I'm, as you might imagine, I'm more sort of the literary studies sort of side of the project. So as far as what literature we're looking at, the American story that we're working on the literary side would take up a novel by, for instance, Lawrence Stallings, which came out in 24. Which is set in DC, which is about this sort of like white protagonist who ends up losing a leg. But then we're pairing that with a novel by the African-American veteran and soldier Victor Daley, who has this great novel, Not Only War, which came out in, I think, 32. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Which, you know, culminates in this, you know, quite gripping and terrible sort of final battlefield scene. And, you know, so what we're interested in doing is bringing those two novels and this sort of picture of the process of memory making in Frederick into, you know, contact with a variety of constituencies, including, of course, African Americans at the time. Mm-hmm.
My own question, and I could do this on my own, but I'm trapped right now in Zoom. Do either of you gentlemen know, Not Only War, has that been reprinted? Is that available for general purchase?
Yeah.
Yes, great, good. Stephanie, you hearing this? She buys my books, so.
Okay.
University of Virginia. I think
it's a great read.
I think we had talked about it before, Corey, in an email. It's sounding, it's
I think we might have, yeah. Yeah, we use it in class and our seminars and those things, yeah.
Yeah.
Fabulous. Okay. All right. Next question. Do you know of any memorials that are in the works? Wait a minute. Where was this from? I mean, I'm sorry. Carrie just gave this one to me. Okay. Let me go back to my other sheet of paper. Okay. All right. This is from Scott. It seems that post World War I and post Civil War memorials were dominant were dominated by local movements. When did the shift toward national monuments begin to occur?
Yeah, so that's really later in the 20th century, the second half of the 20th century. I mean, in many ways, I mean, so you do have Lincoln, you have Jefferson. The interwar period does see national memorials, but I mean, I think to me, I don't know, Dr. Dodman might disagree. I'm thinking of Mile End's Wall as the sort of, you know, if you think about the mall as the place for national war memorials, that kind of marks that beginning. And then of course, Korea and the Second World War. I think, you know, the United States, and I think this is partly of what makes, the First World War occurs at the 50th anniversary of the Civil War. The country clearly is still healing with that. It is still grappling with that. This whole idea of rallying together as a nation to go off and fight in a foreign war is just really difficult. The government creates this narrative through propaganda and speeches during the war, but you really see after the war, when you start to look at local memorials, that it's not clear what being American means. So the idea of a national memorial, I think, is really difficult. It's why DC becomes, there isn't one, right? It's this division and that division and the DC soldiers, but there is no national memorial, I think, because there's not really this clear sense of what American is. Not that there ever really is. I mean, any national identity is the case. And I can just say, I know this is Frederick focused, but you find similar matters going on in France and Germany and in the UK. I mean, the First World War just raises all kinds of questions for national identity in general, in varying ways overseas, but the US is very much struggling with that here. But the whole national push really comes in the second half of the 20th century. I mean, in part, it's what the Second World War does for national narratives that the First World War doesn't.
Thank you. Okay, now I now understand Wendy's question, and excuse me, Wendy, for being thick about this. Okay, so Wendy has two questions. The first, were the words on the Frederick World War I memorial intentionally raised to make it easier to do rubbings as opposed to indented? You know, so they stand up.
That's a very good question. I have not, well, I'll confess I haven't necessarily looked into that. I have not come across anything to suggest that that is the case. Many of the memorials in the area are raised, which I take, again, this is not something I'm an expert on, I take to be a common feature of the process of making these plaques. But I could be wrong. It's a really interesting question.
Yeah, isn't it? I never would, which is why I had trouble understanding it, because it never would have occurred to me.
That's a great question. I'm curious. Yeah,
it really is. Okay, so her second part question is that, for example, she knows the Claire McCardle will be memorialized soon on the creek, as probably most people here know, or at least for around Frederick. Do you know of any other memorials that are in the works? For example, those that died in this pandemic?
I don't. That's a question we've been talking about and thinking about a lot. How will and if so, how will the pandemic be commemorated in the memorial landscape? There are, I came to this earlier this summer, there are influenza memorials across the United States. There aren't a ton, but they are there. There are some plaques in Frederick that I've gathered in private houses, which I haven't been able to see. But there isn't, to my knowledge, a Frederick influenza memorial. So I wonder if it will happen. One of the questions Dr. Dodman and I have talked about is really the how. Are we still in a moment of plaques and statues? Will it be more of a living type of memorial? What does a memorial in the 21st century look like? I mean, so much of what's done in 1918 to 24 in Frederick is really just drawing on late 19th century practices. So what does it mean in 2021 or 2025, whenever, to erect a memorial? What does that look like? What form does it take? I don't know. I'm not aware of one, but it's a question I'm quite interested in following. And yeah.
The only thing I would add to that is that there's a book, a fairly recent book. This is sort of lit crit scholarship, so it's an acquired taste, I will admit. But it's, the title of it is, it came out in 2019. The author is Elizabeth Utka. Viral Modernism is the title. And essentially what Utka proposes is that rather than view modernist literature post-war through the lens that we always seem to, and that is through the lens of the First World War and the 10 million deaths or so. What happens if we look at modernist literature of the 20s and 30s through the prism of, instead, the pandemic and the 50 million to 100 million deaths globally in the pandemic? What do we then notice about literary representations of the time? And I think it's a fascinating reframing of the period. I think part of her thesis is, why do we remember, male military deaths, and how has the whole influenza pandemic, 50 to 100 million deaths kind of gone down the memory hole? Mm-hmm. Why aren't there memorials to pandemic victims from the period when there's a doughboy on every corner? I think it's a really, really fascinating question that Utka raises in 2019. Seems like a really prescient book. I mean, yeah. I don't know if somehow she saw our present, but it's probably a timely read, if nothing else. And I think it's a real contribution to modernist criticism. Mm-hmm. So maybe worth checking out.
It makes me think a little bit, Jill Craig, who runs Wilbur, which is the digital site out of Western Maryland Library where they put up digital exhibits. It's like Digital Maryland. And I know when Jill was doing research on World War I, and I think I had talked to one of you gentlemen about this at some point in time, her thought was, when we're commemorating those who died during the war, because how do I phrase this well, that we're not commemorating like suicides, those people who died by their own hand before going to war. She talks about one guy from, I think Hagerstown, who, went to boot camp, got a Dear John letter and promptly killed himself, and those other tragedies of the war. And then about the pandemic, I think, will we have memorials that will be virtual, which then will go away being the jaded archivist that will not stand the test of time the way that these stones will.
Well, I would just add, I mean, that's part of the bigger book project that we're working on is incorporating the literature of the period, because that's precisely one of the things you find in the memorial landscape. It's in general the male soldiers who died, but yeah, the suicides, the injuries, all of that is not commemorated there. The home front is also not commemorated there. I mean, the Frederick Memorial, it's a military memorial. It's not talking about the home front. It's not commemorating people's experiences there, but the literature at the time really is serving as a kind of memorial in its own right. People are writing about these things. They're writing about the suicides. They're writing about experiences of mothers who lost loved ones in the war. They're writing about issues of race and class in ways that the memorial landscape is not. And so to really understand how people are processing the war in those first 2 decades, you have to bring the literature of the period in to the discussion.
Fabulous. Okay, from Liz Chateau, how does the World War I monument and others fit into the context of the Beautiful City movement?
Well, I mean, I think in some ways it's honestly not something that we've looked at too much at this point. I think it fits insofar as there's this whole debate over how best to memorialize the war. Should it be through parks and livable, usable spaces, or should it be through statuary art, a la what we see after the Civil War in the 19th century? I think that the official memorial landscape that you see in Frederick is very much one of statues and traditional memorials. And I think there was a sense that was all being created to give Frederick a unique look and aesthetic. They're very conscious of what the First World War Memorial will add to the Francis Scott Key Memorial and all the other sites that we've talked about today in terms of shaping what the experience of Frederick is like. I know that there's a quote coming to mind from one of the committee members when this whole debate is going on where to put the memorial. The debate was, where do we put this thing? And they said, look, we don't want it on North Market Street because it turns into a tourist attraction then. That's a major thoroughfare. Everybody's heading to Gettysburg. The landscape architect said, yeah, if you do that, you're going to have to raise it up so it can be higher so people can have the vista wood driving by. You know, the public thought, well, that's great, everybody will see our memorial, but the estates, if you will, behind this said, yeah, but we don't want a tourist attraction. We want it to be in a place for contemplation where people that want the memorial can seek it out and find it and reflect on it. So I don't know, that's not to necessarily address the whole broader beautiful city movement, but it is a reflection on you know, the kind of aesthetic considerations that those in Frederick were taking.
All I would add to that, and Corey, you've already touched upon it, is that there was quite a bit of tension in the period over this question about tourism versus pilgrimage.
Yeah.
The novel that I think evokes this best is Fitzgerald's great novel Tender is the Night, which was published in the 30s, but and of course it's not set in Frederick, but rather in Europe. But the characters visit a former battlefield of the Western Front, Beaumont Hamel, which Corey and I have been to and taken students to. It's a battlefield that's been left largely as is. It's quite unique on the Western Front. So there's trenches and shell holes and it's unexploded ordnance, etc. But one of the things that happens in that scene, it's quite a memorable one, is the characters effectively sort of like enter into a kind of debate about what one does in that sort of space. Is one a tourist here? Are they pilgrims? You know, what are their motivations? And I think, you know, communities across America who are deciding on trying to remember the First World War are also, you know, battling against these different currents. Well, what if, do we want a whole bunch of cars coming by here or horses and buggies on their way to Gettysburg, you know, just another stop on the tour? Or do we really want something where, and this maybe loops back to the City Beautiful movement, that people will, you know, find a contemplative, deliberately designed contemplative space to remember. You know, that is, you know, akin to a kind of pilgrimage as opposed to just another sort of place on the itinerary.
Mary, can I add one thing?
Anything you like.
Just occurred to me an earlier question. I mean, it sort of connects to this, but something Dr. Dodman just said about the idea of the national memorials. We don't really get into it in this talk, but there are national memorials being built, at least in the eyes of officials in Washington, and those are the cemeteries in Europe. Oh. The federal government would have preferred for all American families to leave the dead overseas. They wanted these cemeteries to be sort of advertisements, if you will, for American commitment to Europe, American commitment to peace, and American might. It's a real point of controversy. If anybody's interested, there's a fascinating book by Lisa Boudreau called Bodies of War about this whole process of bringing the bodies home. The government goes back and forth over whether or not it will even be possible. And of course it finally is, but there is a real sense that we're going to build these memorials overseas, that these memorials will serve a kind of foreign policy function. Of course, the interesting question then is, what does that mean if you put the national memorial somewhere where people can't get to it? I mean, right, it's sort of removed there, which is again why I think it's so important to think about place and the interaction between all these localities to really understand what's going on with World War I.
Do you think that relates, and I'm probably gonna phrase this incorrectly, when they were taking the Gold Star mothers to Europe?
Yes, absolutely.
Part of that, like, we want to keep your boys there, but we will take you to them.
Yeah, that fits clearly within that. Yeah, and those pilgrimages run into the 30s. Absolutely, that is of course, that, you know, speaking of the issue of race, those are also segregated. There are separate pilgrimages for, you know, the African American community and for the white community. But that is yes, very much part of that. We'll build these overseas, and then we'll bring you there. That's also something that's reflected on in the literature of the period. Yeah.
Okay. Anything else from you, Dr. Dodman? No? Okay, well, as we wrap up here, I do want to tell everybody, because everyone pay attention to the chat as best you can. Lots of exchanges going on there. My intention is to pull together a bibliography of everything that's all the sources, the books at least, that are mentioned throughout the day. So we don't, I mean, I can't run herd on it right now, okay? So we'll pull together a bibliography and send that out. Also, for the people who are not from immediately around here or don't frequent the public library, shame on you, or the history tent at the Great Frederick Fair. Arch has done exhibits relating to the African-American guys from Frederick who served. They have some beautiful photographs in them. So keep that in mind, and always, you know, keep an eye out for the Heritage Center, which will be opening in 2-ish years, and we'll be hearing more about that later. I think I got everybody's questions. If for some reason I missed your question, you have 30 seconds to put it in the chat, and I can always pick it up later and send it out. Thank you so much, very much, Doctors Dodman and Campion. This was wonderful. These sort of talks always make, although I'm thankful, I'm well gone from college, and no disrespect meant to my professors. I wish I had people like you guys when I went through college. Not that Len Lakowski wasn't great, but it's a much different history experience now attending as an undergraduate than in my day, that I wanted to have you guys here. So thank you so much. And as always, don't be strangers to anyone in the Frederick history community.
We won't. We welcome the help and the interaction. Thanks so much.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Everybody. Thank you.
Take care.
Okay, to everyone else, and feel free to stay as long as you like, gentlemen. I know you have some other plans for the day. Our next speaker is in the room. Give us a few minutes to get her set up. So this is your chance to run for a cup of coffee and be back like 30 seconds.
Thanks, Mary.
Thank you, Corey. Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Oh, there she is.
Hello. Hello, Mary. How are you?
Hi. We're always running a few minutes behind.
It's okay. No worries. No worries.
We got everybody here the whole day. They just have to live with a few extra minutes here and there.
It'll be all right.
So we'll get up and running maybe at 10:40.
That works.
Okay, Kelly, do you have a screen that you want to share?
Yep.
Okay, we will make you, Carrie's going to make you a co-host. And you are already a co-host. She is ahead of me.
Done.
And for anyone who's still in the room, be back. Well, if you're still in the room, you don't have to be back by 10:40, but we will get started at 10:40.
Unless they want to run real fast and do something in the next 4 minutes.
Thank you again for joining us here today.
Oh yeah, I'm excited. I wish it was in person, but that's okay. Maybe next year.
We will have you back in write another book. Write another book.
There you go.
Do you have a book coming? Is that?
I've got a cookbook that I'm working on. I'm writing all the historical sidebars and like introductory blurbs for a soul food cookbook. But yes, I'm doing that. I'm finishing up my Great Courses series on the history of sugar. So that's something, you know, and that the lectures, writing out lectures is bizarro to me because I don't read when I talk, but that's going to be the amount of words is equivalent to the same size as my book. So that'll be, in essence, a spoken book on the history of sugar. And then, yeah, I've got some book projects in the back of my head that I got to get on. But
you know when your cookbook will be out? Do you have a due
date? Summer. I think it's June or July. So I've got a bunch of deadlines looming on April 1st. So I got to get on.
Cool. Well, maybe we'll have you back next year about that. I just got Rice in the mail, Michael's new book.
Awesome. Yeah, I need to get that. I'm behind on all kinds of things. I'm just too busy with my own stuff right now to like be able to relax and enjoy somebody else's work.
I know. I don't know. It's not like me to get it so quickly. And, you know, it even came, I think March 1st is the official date, but Amazon has brought it to me.
Awesome. Awesome. Is it raining up there? It's definitely gloomy here at Stratford.
It was raining before. Right now, it looking out Carrie's window. It's gloomy but dry.
Okay. Yeah, I guess it's drying up a little bit. I just, you know, either snow or just become spring. I don't want this mess.
I know. I have some new shoes I've been thinking about wearing, but I have to walk to my car through some mud. I'm like, I'm not gonna wear my shoes for that. They're still new enough that I don't want to, you know, and they're pretty. They're like fancy shoes. Yeah. They have a nice black and white checkerboard pattern, and I don't want to. Oh, they might be.
Yeah, we've got a guy coming tomorrow and Monday that's going to fire up our bake oven for the first time in forever and try to make bread in the kitchen. So I'm pretty excited about that.
That is exciting. Carrie wants to come.
Come on down. He'll be baking on Monday. It's not that far of a drive from where you guys are, I don't think.
No, it's not very far. To get started. Thank you everyone for remaining here with us, and thank you so much, Kelly, for coming out. Dr. Kelly Fanto-Dietz, we are so excited to have you here with us. For those of you who are on, who attend consortium meetings, we have been trying to get Kelly, I mean, not that it's been hard, she's been willing to come, but our plans for her keep falling through. So we are delighted that this, one of the things about our Zoom world, though she would have come up to Frederick, I'm sure, was to
Definitely.
get here. And we're hoping to have her back next year because we're expecting big things. Anyway, feel no pressure, Kelly. We're expecting big things.
Oh, no. Pressure away. I'm bringing it. You'll be good.
All right. So Kelly, you all have the program, but I'm going to give you a little brief synopsis. Kelly is the Director of Programming, Education, and Visitor Engagement at Stratford Hall and a visiting scholar in the Department of African American Studies at UC Berkeley. She holds a BA in Africana Studies and History from the College of William Mary, which is where I wanted to go, and an MA and PhD in Africa. I never can say this.
Diaspora.
Diaspora. The pandemic really has broken down any communication skills.
I know everybody, when they read my bio, I feel bad because most people are like, they look at me and they try to say it. You're fine. You're good.
It is a word I usually can use, but really it's
the pressure of COVID and reading. Go ahead. Sorry.
And my communication skills have always been unusual to begin with, and it's been worse lately. Studies from the University of California at Berkeley. She is the author of the critically acclaimed book available in the FCPL Maryland room. And also there are circulating copies, Bound to the Fire, How Virginia's Enslaved Cooks Help Invent American Cuisine, which was named one of the top 10 books on foods of 2017 by Smithsonian Magazine. So that's very exciting. Not that the rest of her bio isn't, even just getting her dissertation is exciting, but you know, look, the Smithsonian Magazine. Okay, so we're gonna go ahead and feel free to share your screen, Kelly. And
awesome.
Same rules still apply. We will be monitoring the chat. Don't forget that this is meeting, not webinar, and we can see you and hear you. So thank you.
Hello, everyone. Give me 1 second here. Let me get started. I want to, as I'm messing around with these buttons, I want to thank you for having me. I have deep roots in Maryland. They go back to the 17th century. My father was from, how do you say that whenever someone is passed, from Cumberland, Maryland, and the rest of that family tree, I mean, seriously, is steeped back all over the entire state. So it's an honor to be here with you today. And I'm excited to talk about my work. So I'm also a museum consultant and I've been training docents. I'm in the Mid-Atlantic region for the last 10 years. And I'm completely obsessed and passionate about using kitchens and food as a way to talk about power and place and memory at these historic sites. So today I'm going to be talking about my book, Bound to the Fire, How Virginia's Enslaved Cooks Helped Invent American Cuisine. And it's funny that when this book came out, places like the Smithsonian, Eater magazine, there were several other online presences and institutions that named this some sort of great book about food. And I don't think of it necessarily about food. I think of it more about the labor and the people who are making the food, but that's, I think, the important juncture that my work takes. It takes the history of the people who cooked and tethers it to the actual food that we think and we talk about that's a little bit more comfortable than talking about enslaved labor. So I'm going to launch right in here. So why cooks? Why did I pick this? What are we going to be talking about today? So I picked cooks for a couple of reasons. And again, this project started as my dissertation when I was at UC Berkeley, but I was a professional chef for 10 years. Then I became a complete history nerd, fell in love with the discipline, and found myself as a graduate student at UC Berkeley trying to figure out what on earth I was going to spend years writing about. And then eventually, honestly, at this point, it's been 15 years total of me thinking about this topic and researching this topic. But for me, my passion and dedication to the history of enslaved African and African Americans, with my background and history there, along with my experience as a professional cook, led me to the archives with a certain lens. And when I went into the archives and I was looking at the 18th century Virginia Gazette, because that's what good history nerds do, I was just combing through online and sort of looking at the newspapers, trying to think of something that was really going to pull me in. And I found myself finding the section for, quote, slaves for sale, right? Enslaved people being sold in the sort of classifieds of the 18th century. And I noticed very quickly that there were several cooks being sold. And I was reading their descriptions and thought to myself, wait a second. So I went to the index of the newspaper and I saw the list, slaves as butchers, slaves as, etc. And then when it got to cooks, there were literally hundreds and hundreds of ads. And I immediately had, hundreds of questions about who these people actually were. So what I do with this talk today, what I want you to think about as, historians yourself, as people that work in public history, as docents, I want you to think about the myths that are attached to these cooks. I'll be talking about those. I'll be talking about the reality of their lives. And so the history of these people and also their legacy in American culture. So we're just going to start right here. And let me minimize my face so I don't look at myself. Distracting when you do these talks. Okay, so let's jump right in here. Myths of the plantation kitchen. So this picture right here is from one of the places that has actually had a fairly large impact on my life. This painting is a mid-20th century painting from Berkeley Plantation in Charles City County, Virginia. And I won't say that their interpretation is spectacular, or even at the time I was going there to visit, I was 17, 18, 19 years old. It was in the 90s. They absolutely were not talking about things in an accurate and sort of holistic way. But this image, in that space in particular too, Berkeley Plantation is the first place that I saw as a California kid visiting, my dad out here in Virginia. I went and ran into I ran up to the external kitchen and looked in the windows and thought to myself, what happened here? Because at that point I've been working in restaurants for several years and I had questions for the first time about a historical site. So this is very much the image that is promoted and sort of cherished, I would say, at a lot of historical sites. If they talk about the enslaved labor, it is very much situated in this very clean kitchen. You have this wonderful, happy, group of enslaved people cooking in this, sort of romantic space. You've got the mistress of the house, also very clean, leading the efforts, cooking the food with her helpers. And it is this image that I think has really permeated most of the interpretation across the Southern United States when it comes to enslaved cooks, when it comes to these historical kitchens. And it is something that I actively push back against. One of the reasons that I push back against it and why it's hard to push back against is this sort of idea that these enslaved people were somehow happy, loyal slaves, that they were illiterate, that their whole purpose was there to make white people happy. This sort of propaganda campaign, there's really no other way to put it. This sort of narrative was put out during the 19th century when abolitionists from the North and other places were really pushing against the institution of enslavement, and Southern, sort of proud Southern, slave owners were pushing back saying, look, they're like family, it's Aunt so-and-so, it's Uncle so-and-so. And these people, they're loyal, they're happy to be here. So this, what is called Black Americana, and I'm sure a lot of you have seen these things. Whenever I give this talk, I get, now I would say, a chat or an email afterwards, but before COVID, I would get people coming up to me afterwards, sort of embarrassingly saying, I actually have some of this stuff in my house. I don't know what to do with it. Would you like it? So I have actually a fairly large collection of Black Americana in boxes. I used to have it in my office when I was teaching regularly to sort of use the teaching tool. But these sort of objects, these racist objects, promote the idea of these loyal slaves that, you're happy in that kitchen. And then also after emancipation, it physically places these sort of the iconography of Black servitude in those spaces to create this sort of myth of happy servitude. So what kills me about this is, and Aunt Jemima was just retired this last summer, right? So I'm like, oh my goodness, like after all these years. So I want you to think about as well how on one hand, you can go into Kroger, you can go into Giant Grocery or, Safeway or wherever, and you can find, at least until recently, Aunt Jemima products. You can find Uncle Rassus on the cream of wheat, Uncle Ben on the rice, right? Who's also, either is retired or going to be retired very soon. I think he's still on the grocery store shelves, but you see this very sort of prominent representation of Black chefs on this kind of merchandise. Yet when it comes to actually thinking about who helped create American cuisine and the history of these people, they're almost absent from the narrative. So it's kind of a weird contradiction there. One of the myths that I want to talk about as well, and I'm sure that some of you might be guilty of this, but I want to talk for a minute about sort of the idea that the fireplaces inside of the house, in the hearth, kitchen were so dangerous. And so the food was so messy that they had to move the inside kitchens, to the outside. So I want you to think for a moment, and I don't know if any of you work at a plantation house, and also the work that I'm doing and that I've done is on larger plantation homes. So I'm not talking about the plantation homes or historical houses that are, they don't have an external kitchen. They were somewhat smaller. I really focus on the ones that were so large and so prominent that literally the food being created there was the food that was known internationally. That was the food that really became tethered to American cuisine. So on these sites, places like Stratford Hall, which I think I lost the slide, places like Stratford Hall, we have a kitchen that was built at the same exact time in 1738 outside of the house. And so one of the things that you find in these plantation tours, and I'm sure some of you say this, is that the kitchens were moved outside because one, it was stinky, and two, because of fire hazard. So a lot of this sort of knowledge and education that's given at these sites, it comes from this quote from 1705 regarding kitchen space. It says, all their drudgeries of cookery, washing, dairies, etc., are performed in the offices detached from their dwelling houses. This is where it gets funky. Why, by this means are kept more cool and sweet. I push back against this for two reasons, actually three reasons. First of all, during this period, 1705, indentured white servitude has pretty much been, predominantly taken over by the enslaved Africans that were being brought over from West and Central Africa, from the 12.5 million that were brought during the entire slave trade. So you've got this very, sort of sharp turn in the mid 1600s, a downturn of indentured white servitudes, those people that would have been cooking in those kitchens. For instance, at Stratford, one of our first cooks, and it was in 1738, his name was Richard Minot. He was an indentured Englishman. The person that trained underneath him was an enslaved African-American man. So you do have this sort of switching from indentured servitude being the sort of go-to, like white labor in that kitchen, to then having enslaved African and African-Americans in those kitchens. And then you also see a spike in women coming over as well. The colonies are really taking hold. They're becoming established. So by 1705, a lot of these large plantation kitchens had external kitchens. And there is a serious, sort of really strong records that have been looked at by architectural historians that show the sort of the correlation between that dip of indentured servitude and the height and the rise of enslaved African and African Americans to the separation of those kitchens as a space to sort of delineate and sort of designate racialized space. So this is right during the period where slave codes are becoming abundant, where issues about race and status and slavery are becoming really contentious as early as this period. And so with the sort of separation of that space, it was a way for these larger plantation homes to separate that enslaved labor from the mistress of the house, etc. One of the things that I also sort of laugh at is the whole fireplace thing. So Stratford Hall itself has 16 fireplaces and 8 chimneys. In the wintertime, if it was, back then, right now, there would have had fires in all of the upstairs fireplaces. And so the idea that somehow that's not a fire hazard, when you have somebody literally in the kitchen, the title of my book, bound to the fire 24 hours a day, watching that actual fire burn, it doesn't make a lot of sense why somehow that kitchen would catch fire before the main house would catch fire. And lastly, the smell. I want you to think for a moment about how often people bathed during 1705, and think also for a moment how delicious that kitchen probably smelled. So I like to use those examples to kind of push back against this very common narrative that you find at these sites. Another thing that I look at in my book that I find incredibly interesting is the sort of politics of these spaces. So I'm also in a moment here, and I want to have a discussion after I finish my talk about the power of food, how to use these spaces to talk about more than just food, to talk about the labor, the power, the politics of the period. And I would also spread that out and say you can also talk about things inside of the house. So something like a dumbwaiter on the left here, this wonderful, sort of modern at the time piece of furniture was popularized by Thomas Jefferson himself. And he brought it over from France because it served a very important purpose. On one hand, Jefferson loved any gadget, as you see over here. He has this dumbwaiter built into his, kitchen fireplace or dining room fireplace where wine can just appear out of nowhere. But what does this sort of appearing wine and dumbwaiter have in common? They have in common the fact that during this period, especially during the Revolutionary War period, where you really see these and the closing of the transatlantic slave trade, 1807, 1808, between the sort of 1770s and the early 1800s, you see a heightened sort of conversation about abolitionism. You see a heightened conversation about slave revolts, like in Haiti. People are talking at the dinner table about Patrick Henry, give me liberty or give me death. So ideas about race, about status, about slavery, about the new nation, who we were going to be as a nation that claimed to be a place, freedom and equality for all, what does that actually mean? So politics were being talked about at the table in ways not the same they had been before. And the topic of slavery was absolutely part of those dinner conversations. So by having something like a dumbwaiter is put into your home, into your dining room, think about the name itself, a dumbwaiter. You would have a place like Monticello, you would have a place like Stratford Hall, you would have a place like Mount Vernon and Montpelier be able to flex who was in that space at certain times to control what then was leaked back to the enslaved community. So that's something that I find absolutely fascinating. Another thing that you see pop up during these periods are these underground passageways. And, you do see sort of, the Palladian design popping up. You see additions. Montpelier had this where, during I think during that period, it was like the early 1800s, late 1700s, you see them sort of add these sort of, palisade type of, things in between the kitchen and the main house. You also see these plantation homes start digging out places like Berkeley Plantation, the literal underground passageway for the enslaved people, the butlers, the waiters, the cooks to bring the food inside. And one of the things that you hear a lot, and again, I mentioned earlier about my love of Berkeley Plantation, just because it really sparked my want to sort of push back against these narratives, to think about the ways in which docents have power, public history sites have power. The average person does not read a book on history. The average person, we would hope, would go to a historical site, and that's where they engage with our sort of nation's past. So one of the most common things that I've heard at these sites is encompassed in this sign over here that is no longer at Berkeley Plantation, and it's called the Whistling Walk Underground Passage. And the tour the way it was until very recently, until the sign was taken down, until they started to really take the history and interpretation of enslavement into consideration, they used this sign right here as the only nod to the history of the enslaved at that site. So you would go on a tour that was very heavily decorative arts focused, which again is fine. But again, I do believe that it's important to talk about the politics, the history, the uses of these pieces, more so than this is made out of mahogany. It was, made in England in 1792. Those things are wonderful, but how was it used, right? That's what engages the public. So when we'd get to the end of the tour, they would point to the sign and they would say, this is the Whistling Walk Underground Passage right below our feet. And you would stare over at the kitchen, the same kitchen that I peered into the windows when I was 17 years old. You would look over there and they would say, every single time. And trust me, I took this tour as recently as maybe 10 years ago, I guess, which isn't that recent, but in my long sort of tenure of doing that, it's pretty recent. And they did the same thing. And they said that the cook or the waiter had to whistle while they walked to make sure so the planter family would know that they weren't eating the food. Now, that is the most ridiculous narrative I've ever heard in my life. And I knew it was silly back when I was 17, and I continued to think about it for several years afterwards, actually more than that, I would say about 2 decades afterwards. So I want you to think about this for a moment. And maybe some of you have a whistling walk at your site. Maybe some of you have heard this at a historical site. But the idea that these whistling walkways were to force enslaved people to make noise as they come through that walkway, to also then prevent them from eating the food makes absolutely no sense. These cooks were literally elbow deep in biscuits. They were tasting the food, and I'm going to talk about their power and agency in a moment. But this sign right here is a Jim Crow era sign. And what I've noticed, and I'm sure some of your sites also are sort of wed to this, there was a total rewriting of history during the Jim Crow era. And I would argue that our textbooks up until very recently, historic site tours, history books, history courses, right? Even at the college level, were very wed to this idea of this sort of separation, right? Enslaved cooks, of course they weren't tasting the food. They had to whistle while they walked underneath. This was very much a Jim Crow era idea that was all about separation of the races, where if you think about back during the period of enslavement in the colonial era and the antebellum era, you had enslaved African-American women as wet nurses, nursing these white babies. They were sleeping at the foot of your bed. They were cooking your food. So there was definitely, how do you go from that very close-knit, not close-knit in a power sense or in a control sense, but like close-knit, like physical, spatial sort of relationship to then what happened during Jim Crow? You have to create this kind of propaganda that supports that. Now, here is my dear Stratford Hall, and I want to invite any of you and all of you to come visit us here. I was brought to Stratford Hall in 2018, and actually as early as 2017, right after the Charlottesville sort of, the riots and the events that happened there. The previous president reached out to me, and I'd been giving talks there and such, and he asked me to come be a consultant and help integrate the story of the enslaved into the site. And I was honored to do this. This is the birthplace of Robert E. Lee. It was something that I felt very passionate about. I am passionate about, and there was no more important site at that particular moment that I would want to give my time to help round out that narrative, to elevate the story of the enslaved African and African Americans who literally built this beautiful 1738 Georgian mansion. The kitchen is right here on the right side, and I invite any of you and all of you to come out and visit. So let's talk for a moment about some hospitality. I know for a fact that probably all of you know what these pineapples are all about. So normally I do this Socratically and we have this whole engagement, but for the sake of time, because I want to have a rich discussion after I finish blabbing at you all, I want to talk about sort of why pineapples, right? Why did these become the symbol of hospitality? And why on earth am I talking about this when I'm talking about enslaved labor? So hospitality is synonymous with Southern US, right? And I know Marylanders are like, okay, where do we fit in that? I totally get it. But the Mason-Dixon line is a totally, socially constructed line. And we all know that there were enslaved folks north of it. And they were also abolitionists living in the South. So that sort of binary history is also problematic. So let's talk for a moment though about pineapples and why they are the symbol of hospitality. So places like Stratford Hall, where I work now, places like the Lees, any of the wealthy planters that had connections to the Atlantic world, that were getting shipments of rum from Barbados, that were getting, textiles shipped out, etc. They were getting also, sort of shipments of produce and things from the tropics. And if you were lucky enough to have those connections, wealthy enough to pay for a pineapple that had to somehow make it on a ship from this, somewhere in the Caribbean, the tropics, up until say, to Maryland, to somewhere like Stratford Hall, you would take that exotic fruit and you would keep it until someone very important or a friend or whomever was visiting, and you would take that exotic fruit that is absolutely rare and you would share it with that person. So the funny thing that I love to say as well, and it's not as sexy at all, and I think that's probably why we don't have celery stalks all over the South on, on statues and things and in front of homes. Celery was also an exotic vegetable during the time, so exotic that it had its own jar, a glass jars and vases. We have a celery vase, an 18th century celery vase in our kitchen here, because that was another exotic vegetable that you would show off and share. So hospitality is synonymous with these Southern homes. It is synonymous with Southern history. It is synonymous with the present day idea about the South. And what is at the center of all of that? It is the food, and it was the enslaved cooks at these plantations that were making that food. So I want you to think for a moment. This is our great hall at Stratford Hall. Stunning space, important space, a space that has seen everyone from George Washington to others. You would say you were going to come visit the Lees, and it's 1774, right? You get into a carriage, you might spend days coming up, either down from Maryland or up from South Carolina, wherever. You show up anytime during that period, right? There was no cell phones. You couldn't, text somebody and say, hey, we'll be there at 2 a.m. Sorry, we're late. So you show up at whatever time it is. It is Southern custom, right? To then have these bell systems put in homes. And I like to tell people to think about Downton Abbey if they haven't seen these, but Stratford Hall had an elaborate bell system, as did many of these large homes. And it was, there's also holes carved into the servants' quarter, the servants' hall, where the enslaved folks would have to sit up at night waiting for these guests. And they had holes to peep out to see them coming up the road. So you would have to be ready to welcome anybody, right? Enslaved footmen and butlers would have to come out and help unload all of the objects off of the carriage, help the lady of the household, or not the household, but the visitor, the lady of the family into the house get settled. This was a 24-hour cycle. So anybody working in that home had to be, one, dressed to the nines, act a particular kind of way, and be on call no matter what was happening. In the kitchen, the cook also would have the bell rung, and you would have to get up if they were hungry at any time of the day, any time of the night. These enslaved cooks had to prepare food, even if it was as simple as some biscuits and some ham, all the way to oyster stews, but they had to prepare these things for whoever came into that space. Now, this right here is Stratford Hall's kitchen. These pictures are a bit dated. I need to go over there and take some better ones because I've definitely outfitted that space. It looks pretty great right now, but you see here, this right here is Mr. Payne. He was born into slavery here at Stratford Hall and then ended up working here long after his emancipation. And right down here, we have Miss Martha, who still works here. She used to do hearth cooking here at Stratford Hall, and now she's one of our only docents that sadly, after COVID, we had to lay off a lot of people, but she's one of our only docents still here. And she does a wonderful job interpreting food and the history of Stratford Hall. But these spaces were not, they were not Julia Child's kitchen, right? So a lot of myths around these people that were working in these kitchens, these men, women, and some children that were working in these kitchens, there's this weird idea that somehow it was easier working in the house, right? I told you a moment ago that they were on watch 24/7. Enslaved cooks literally were on call 24/7. They had to cook huge feasts, everything from gigantic feasts and barbecues and fish fries to up to 100 people, all the way to a 20-person dinner party. Also, the daily meals for all of the free people that were in that space, and cook for the enslaved domestic African and African Americans that were working in the house as well. So they had to literally be bound to that fire. This is not a wolf range, and I'm sure a lot of you here watching right now have done hearth cooking, and I love talking to hearth cooks. I learn something new every time. But working in front of this fire, and I have to say this particular hearth is gigantic, and I think that there's, this really shows how much the Lees were entertaining. But cooking up against one and literally in these fires, it's an exhausting job. You're lifting heavy pots. I mean, this woman right here, Miss Martha, That's, you know, it's not the heaviest thing, but having to bend down, lift pots of water, literally burning yourself almost, you know, routinely as you're working in the bread oven, burning yourself on the hot iron that's on the fire. And, you know, enslaved cooks ended up actually dying of burns at a rate more than anybody else. And so they definitely had their scars and that burden of cooking all the food in these actual spaces. And I want to think for a moment, you know, some people might say, okay, fine, but, you know, this site had nothing to do with enslavement. You know, these people were not slave owners. There were no enslaved folks here. You know, why is this important for anybody to talk about? Well, the fact of the matter is that people were eating and consuming objects, living a lifestyle, especially men of this stature, that was literally funded by forced enslaved African and African-American labor. So I want you to think for a moment about, this is a typical parlor scene, right? Ladies, we would not be allowed in this space. I might try to like throw a wig on and sneak in there if it was me back in the day, but you know, it's not. So even one of these very important conversations, you know, conversations that led up to our Revolutionary War, to the birth of this country, conversations that led to the Civil War, conversations that led to statewide governmental decisions, you know, the politics of place, the sort of political fabric of this nation, so much of that involved, just like it does today, wining and dining. So these folks right here are probably sipping on Madeira that was made by enslaved labor, shipped by enslaved labor. They're drinking brandies that might have been made on site that was also made by enslaved labor. They are smoking tobacco that absolutely was seeded, grown, you know, cured, shipped by enslaved labor. They are also sipping on rum, most likely, which is a West African recipe. So I'm going to take 1 second to tell you a little bit about rum, because I find the history of rum absolutely fascinating. But you know, there was a long history of palm wine making and liquor making in West and Central Africa long before the slave trade started. And so when enslaved people were, you know, when people were captured in West Africa, enslaved and brought to Barbados and then other places, but particularly in Barbados in the 17th century, the people there, the planters there, they were, you know, they had a sugar sort of estate set up across the island. They were definitely making things like molasses and, you know, the sugar cones that are being sent all over the Atlantic world, but they were throwing away the roughage of the cane. The enslaved community, after laboring, making all of that, the sugar products for their enslaver, they started to take the roughage and they would bring it back to the slave quarters and they turned it into rum. It took 1 second, right, for one overseer to walk down to taste that liquor, and it became one of the most profitable, popular liquors, I would say even today, but definitely during the Atlantic world. If you think about, you know, you think about pirates, you think about rum, you think about, you know, the ways in which that liquor became so much a part of that sort of cultural fabric. So the food that they're eating, the things that they're smoking, the drink that they're drinking are all literal and figurative fruits of enslaved labor. Enslaved cooks were also very much at the center of these parties that would be happening on these plantation homes. So if you think about a place, I mean, Maryland, think about Virginia, think about anywhere that had these plantation estates, a lot of the women, the white ladies that were the mistress of the house, their entire life was in that space. You know, the master of the house, the man of the house might be traveling around doing things. The woman of the house, the white lady of the house, would be staying at home, sort of, you know, looking after her kids when the enslaved nanny was not, sort of really managing that household complex. And part of managing that household complex involved planning, you know, things like balls and dinners, all the social fabric of the period where those political conversations happened. It also was a space, these balls and things, where you would marry off your children. So in my research, I read through countless letters and diaries of these white ladies that talked about the importance of serving a certain kind of meal, the importance of making sure the food was up to par. So-and-so would be happy with their status, right? So food, just like it is now, is an absolute indicator of somebody's status, their sophistication, and at this period, really their connectivity also to the Atlantic world. And the enslaved cooks, of course, were then responsible for making that food and providing that sense of pride to the mistress. And I want you to think also for a moment, these enslaved cooks were seriously skilled. So these elite Virginia homes were not just eating, you know, a bowl of slop with some porridge. They were literally eating at many nights. They were eating 3-course meals. They were eating these, each course had, you know, something like this that you would see several dishes per course. They would also eat so much or serve so much at the dinner table that they wouldn't eat it all, of course, right? So it was all about conspicuous consumption. It was, we're going to show off our wealth and we're all going to nibble on a little bit of this food and talk for a while, and the next course was going to come on. So think about it from the perspective of the enslaved chefs, the cooks that had to make this food. Getting a dinner, I mean, honestly, most people today couldn't put on a dinner like this, right? A 3-course dinner during the colonial era, cooking on a open fire, you know, stove or hearth, making things like these really exquisite tarts, making breads, making pies, you know, making all different soups and stews, all having it be at the absolute perfect presentation and also heat and done at the same time, right, to the mistress's sort of liking. So this power dynamic was really important as well, because enslaved cooks had a lot of responsibility to make the mistress look good. But at times I've read as well in some of the records that you find that the mistresses were more likely to put off a dinner because the enslaved cook wasn't, quote, feeling well. That could have been resistance. That could have been, you know, literally not feeling well, than anybody else that they would sort of consider letting, you know, have some time off, if you will, just because they wanted the food to be a certain kind of quality. So there was so much reliability on behalf of the enslaved cook and the mistress. And that relationship created something that was very nuanced and definitely had power dynamics that you don't see in other occupations, enslaved occupations on a plantation. One of the things that I absolutely love to research and think about, because again, I'm a scholar of African-American history, I am a scholar of slavery, enslaved people, and I think it's very important to understand that, you know, the culture of these folks, you know, they came over with incredible knowledge of food, of everything from, you know, from iron working to, I mean, you name it. So they came over that way. But at the same time, I want you to think for a moment about the power that they had to threaten poison, right? To threaten poisoning their enslaver. And I have a whole section of my book where I talk about the people that were accused of poisoning. And, you know, the hard part about when I was doing that research and I was thinking about it, a lot of men and women and some children were accused of poisoning their master. And that would have been through the food that they were eating. And through the work that I did, I thought to myself as well, a lot of the people and a lot of the trials that I read, these people that were poisoned, whether they died or not, could have literally just had a stomach ache because there was no germ theory. There was no refrigeration. People could have literally just been sick from eating food that wasn't prepared a certain way. But it was times like when the Haitian Revolution happened, when Nat Turner had his rebellion in 1831, where you see this wave of fear sweep through the Southern slaveholding families. And these ladies are terrified to eat because they fear that they are going to be killed by their enslaved cooks. So you have this very nuanced, very pertinent sort of relationship between these white families and those who were cooking for them. And also the back of these recipe books that I looked through, and I'll talk about that here in a second. The recipe books that I looked at and at the Virginia Historical Society, at the small, you know, the Special Collections Library at UVA, at SWEM, at William and Mary, they have these unpublished cookbooks that are written out from the 18th century, from the 19th century. And they have so much information. It's not just about food, but they have a lot of information, excuse me, about what these enslaved cooks were literally looking at. And a lot of these enslaved cooks also were literate. So the back of every single cookbook, you find tonics, medicines, right? So they were administering medicines and making tonics as well. And the difference between medicine and poison is literally dosage, right? You eat, or you take one Motrin versus a bottle, a very different outcome. One of the other myths that I really like to push back against is the idea that these enslaved cooks and people working in the house were somehow disconnected from the folks that were working in the field, that they were sort of more culturally white, and that they sort of abandoned all of their Africanness, if you will, as they moved into that white landscape. What I found in my research, which is pertinent to Maryland sites and Virginia sites in particular, so we can bond together here on this particular coincidence that was happening, but there's been significant archaeological studies that have and evidence that shows the presence of caches, right? Little bundles of things to conjure your ancestors, shells, metal, glass, bound up, put into the hearths of these kitchens. And this is very much in line with practices that are known in hoodoo. And so you have this very strong sort of West African influenced religious practice happening in these kitchen spaces. And it makes me think then, if they have the power to poison, if they have the power to make tonics, if they have the power to conjure your ancestors, to put spells on people, this space, this kitchen space, is not just a crossroads of food, right? And a crossroads of, all the evidence that I read as well of, the white folks coming into the kitchen, the enslaved folks from the quarter coming up. This was a space of cultural collision, right? White, black, free, unfree, West African religious practices versus what they were being forced to sort of worship here. These spaces were really the crossroads of the site. I want to talk for a moment here as well. Let me just make sure I'm not taking too long. Okay, good. Sorry, I just want to make sure I'm not going too crazy here. Go back to my slide. I want to talk for a minute about the food. And again, part of the, not even part of, like really the majority of why I do this is to tether the reality of enslavement to the sort of romance of food, right? So I think it's really important to absolutely talk about the food and the ways in which the African influences and these cooks in particular absolutely helped invent American cuisine, but you have to talk about the reality of their existence as enslaved people on a plantation site, in a plantation site. So I want to talk for a moment about West African influences on American food. Things like the peanut, that's West African. Peanut stew, peanut soup, as they call it in Virginia, is one of our state dishes, right? We love peanut soup. It's this Virginia thing that we eat. Well, that's actually a West African dish that was literally brought over, both in the ways of the crops of peanuts and in the minds of the enslaved that were forced to cook on these plantations. Okra also came from West Africa. Black-eyed peas, collards were grown all over the place, but the ways in which they were cooked as a stew with some meat was definitely a West African recipe that was brought over as well. Things like gumbo is a West African recipe and is absolutely synonymous with the Deep South, especially New Orleans. You have dishes like jambalaya, a rice dish. Now, rice was also brought over from the Sierra Leone area of West Africa, and the Mende people from that area had been growing rice for centuries, and it was those particular enslaved people that were brought to places like the Sea Islands in South Carolina and Georgia to then transfer their skills of rice farming and cooking into that landscape. Jambalaya literally is a descendant of what is called jollof rice, which is a West African rice dish. Look it up if you haven't seen it. It's one of my favorite things to eat. It looks, it tastes, and it has all of the similar things that you would find in jambalaya. So one of the things that I found in terms of all of the ingredients, sort of making its way into what we think of as American cuisine, Southern cuisine in particular, is I read through these cookbooks and I read through the menus, and I thought I put both my chef lens on and my historian lens on, and you find that in the 18th century, the cookbooks that were written, they had a couple of ingredients in there, right? Like you might see okra in something, but it really wasn't these sort of smoking gun West African recipes. By the early 19th century, these cookbooks, you see things like okra stew and gumbo. You see pepper pot, another African influence and African sort of derived dish that really took over, especially where you guys are. I mean, pepper pot was, synonymous with Philadelphia and the outside areas. And these dishes literally were written into these cookbooks. And so I see that as it being written into the American cuisine, written into American culture. I see this as well as these folks were absolutely probably eating these dishes in the 18th century, but you know how long it takes to be like, okay, you know what? I love that recipe. I'm going to write this down. So I think that they were eating these dishes in the 18th century. And then by the early 19th century, they literally had been, you know, they became part of Mary Randolph's cookbook. I mean, they are absolutely literally written into our early American culinary history. I'm going to end my talk by talking about two people that I feel very strongly about. One is the woman on the cover of my book. So and Hercules on the right, we know now that's not really Hercules, but I still like using the image because I think it's really important to have somebody to look at as you think about Hercules and his history and legacy. But on the left here, we've got a woman whose name was not recorded. She is called the Cook, and in 1855, excuse me, an 1855 copy or volume of Harper's Weekly. And a man named David Hunter Strother was traveling from your neck of the woods down to Virginia. So again, you know, that Mason-Dixon line didn't mean too much in terms of that flow of travel and culture, came down to the South to do an expose on what life was like in the South, right, in the 1850s. And he stopped in Amherst County, Virginia, which is just south of Charlottesville. And he stopped for the night and he met the cook at this plantation he was staying at. And he was so struck by her that he wrote this, you know, very sort of poetic missive about how she, you know, was the wisest of all, how she really was the boss of everything in the entire complex, that her children had the first dip, you know, in all gravies and ate the breasts of fried chicken, and really sort of elevated her in the way that I think my particular work elevates these men, women, and some children that had to work in these kitchens. And then he took the moment to actually draw and sketch this woman. Now, I chose her for the cover of my book because we don't know her name. And I think it's really important to break away, and I'm speaking to you now as docents, break away from the idea that if you don't have hard information about somebody, if you don't have, you know, their name, their occupation, etc., that you can't somehow find ways to talk about enslaved people and their history and legacy in this country. And so for me, she represents all of the enslaved women, in particular, African and African-American women who were forced to cook for their enslavers, who have not gotten credit until recently. And then on the right here, we have a portrait of a man who's not Hercules, but again, we can talk about that in a minute if you want to, but I'm going to give you a quick little snapshot of him because I found his story to be so compelling and so powerful. I consider Hercules to be America's first celebrity chef, and I'll tell you why. So Hercules was born in 1754. He married a woman named Alice. Born in 1754. He was purchased by George Washington when he was 16 years old. He was brought to Mount Vernon, and he there then married a woman named Alice, who was the plantation seamstress. They had 3 children together, and his wife dies shortly after his last child was born. He ends up at 32 years old in 1786. He is in that kitchen learning the skills of cooking from an enslaved cook by the name of Nate. George Washington then, decides to move himself, and he brings a small group of enslaved domestics with him to Philadelphia, to the house, the presidential house in Philadelphia. And in the late 1790s. Late in 1790. So like November or so in 1790. Now, George Washington brings Hercules to then work up there, learn sort of the art of cooking on a larger scale, right, from a tavern keeper. He then takes over as head chef of the presidential house in Philadelphia, right? So he is the first president of the United States' enslaved chef. Hercules is remembered in George Washington's step-grandson's memoir as being someone who literally, and when I read this description, it's literally like the Gordon Ramsay of his day. I mean, he ran that kitchen like an army general, you know, like everything was to the T. He would sell his leftovers out of the back door for hundreds of dollars a year. He also would dress up every night after he finished his shift. He would leave everyone to clean up, and he would dress to the nines. He wore blue velvet, silk stockings. He had a hat. He had a cane and a gold watch. And he would stroll down Market Street in Philadelphia, and white men would bow to him. So this man was living also enslaved, but living in a city that had a predominantly large African-American community that was free. So he was going to market, he was meeting free and, African-Americans in Philadelphia. He probably also knew James Hemings. He was also cooking for heads of state from all over the world. Now, the funny thing about all of this, or sort of the shisty thing about all of this, I'll say, is George Washington gets there again in 1790, and he didn't realize that in the 1780s, just shortly before he got up there, that Pennsylvania established the Gradual Emancipation Act, which said that if you were a slave owner in the state of Pennsylvania, Philadelphia included, you had to free your slaves within 6 months. Right? So anybody that would arrive that was also enslaving people had to also do that. Now, Washington shows up with his group of enslaved domestics and doesn't quite know what to do. So instead of being like, okay, maybe I should free them, he decides to not tell them. And what he does is he sends people like Hercules back and forth to Virginia every 5 months and change to re-enslave themselves. So Hercules finds himself in this position of being, a celebrity status in Philadelphia. He's having to be shipped back and forth to touch the earth of Virginia in Mount Vernon every 5 months and change. I guarantee he knew exactly what his enslaver was doing. And also every time he went back and forth, I'm sure he met people along the way that eventually helped him escape. So I want you to fast forward to George Washington's birthday in 1797. And at this point, a year before, so in November of 1796, Hercules has returned back to Mount Vernon. Hercules there is noted as shoveling manure. So something happened during that period. He is back doing manual labor. He is not the chef anymore. He has lost his status that he had in Philadelphia. And Washington comes back shortly after. On his birthday, on Washington's birthday in February of 1797, he wakes up and Hercules has escaped. Now, Hercules, of course, ended up going up to New York and having a career as a chef, and the research has been done recently on that, and a book published as well. And I'll have to remember it's Ramin, and I'm blanking on her last name, but she's written this beautiful book, really sort of diving into his life. But it's kind of funny to me that George Washington, with all of his shystiness of sending people back and forth and not wanting to tell them, that Hercules probably met the person or the people that helped him escape in the long run. So I'm going to end right here with this slide, The Liberation of Aunt Jemima by Betty Saar in 1972 in Berkeley, California. I hope that my work, allows you to reimagine and to rethink the role and the history and legacy of these enslaved cooks. I hope that you think of kitchens as a space of power, as a space of creativity, as a space of pride and pain for all those who cooked in them. And I'm going to stop right there and open it up for questions because I'm blabbing on. All right. Stop my share. All righty.
Great. Thank you.
The weird end of Zoom pause. I'm sorry, Mary, what?
Thank you so much. We have a list of questions. I'm going to make my way through. One thing though that I just want to throw out there really fast, because somewhere early on, something you said made me think about this. I remembered when I read Dr. Gates's book, Colored People, how his grandmother used to contemptuously say, only white people will put the spoon back in the pot. That's a major thing I take away from that, was that only white people are, and every time I'm tasting something that I'm cooking and I put the spoon back in the pot.
You're like, see?
Exactly. And I listened to it, so his words go through my head. Okay, so let's go back to the questions, okay? So the first one, this was early on when you were talking about the passageways, Lynn was saying these types of passageways were also used in the big houses in Ireland in the early 1800s to the Great Famine to keep the poor native Irish separate from the wealthy Norman Irish who ruled over them and kept them segregated. How then were these architectural features transplanted to the colonies for this new purpose of segregating races?
I think you just pretty much said it. So it was happening in places, and I think the Irish have a lot of, of course, they weren't enslaved the same way, absolutely, not the same history, but a lot of the ways in which, but they were also colonized by the British. And so a lot of the ways in which these elite Brits thought of controlling, the lower classes of people, you see some similarities there. And you see that in the architectural, sort of changes that happened or underground things that happened there. So, I think that, real efforts were made, conversations were happening, and you think as well, the colonies were all connected. We think now very much of America as being this sort of isolated space that like, oh, we're Americans, but we were Britain for a long time too. So, those conversations were happening. And, even after the revolution, people knew exactly what each other were doing. Letters were going back and forth between patriots and expats, et cetera. So, they didn't have social media, but they definitely were in cahoots when it came to controlling flow and space and race.
Thank you for that. Okay. From Liz, to what extent do you think the experience of enslaved cooks at the Grand Plantations in Virginia is similar to the experience in Piedmont or Western Maryland, where our plantations were smaller?
Yeah, so it was different. It was absolutely different. So again, my work is really focused on the larger plantations, but what you do see, the differences that happen is you get in those smaller plantations, you might have if they had enslaved people there, you would have had the enslaved cook would have also been the laundress, would have also been the nanny, would have been doing 17 other things in addition to cooking the food. So, that role, and I would say that, the food being eaten at those smaller plantations, the dishes, for instance, might not make their way to the head of, state from somewhere else because they weren't having dinner there. But that's also where you see that sort of that fabric of African food being eaten by the middling plantation owners, and sort of seeping into that sort of middle upper class plantation community.
Related to that is a question from Sunny, which I know Liz approached, but you may have know more about it. And also I know that there are some architectural historians in our crowd who may know more too. But in Western Maryland plantations, where did the cooks live? Were they
Western Maryland?
Yes. And we consider Carroll County West to be Western Maryland. So.
I would love to know that. I'm assuming it really mattered. Also if the kitchen wasn't outside, they'd be living inside of that space. They'd be sleeping in wherever the kitchen was. The kitchen, even here, the cooks would sleep in the kitchen at Stratford Hall because that's where they were working. They had to keep an eye on things, make sure the fire didn't burn anything down. So literally, a lot of times the cooks would literally be sleeping in the kitchen or a room adjacent to it because that was their workspace. And I have not done work at all in Western Maryland. I need to, it's where my family is from. And I would love to get out there and sort of see that history and dive into that. I have been so sort of wedded to Virginia now for so long. I think it's time to break out a little bit.
Broaden your scope and come up north here. And that certainly ties into Sunny, what it did interpretation at Mount Vernon, and also at our Tawny house in Frederick, where Tawny never actually lived. The same thing, the slaves lived above the kitchen. That makes sense. Okay, from Drew, how long did West African religious practices remain common practice in places like Virginia or Maryland? When did those practices start disappearing?
So I would argue that they haven't disappeared even now. I've taught courses on West African religions in the African diaspora. So just think for a moment, 12.5 million, these are the ones that were recorded, right? And captured and enslaved Africans were brought into the African diaspora. Only 4% of those came to the British US. Only 4%, all right? So you see stronger manifestations of West African religion in the Caribbean, right? Who had a significant number of enslaved Africans went there. Brazil, Candomblé, Vodou, Santeria, like all of these religions are incredibly African, right? Masked with things like Catholicism. What you see in the British US, which is I think really fascinating, is you see it intersect with Protestantism, which is a very different sort of aesthetic, right? I'm Catholic, when I started looking at things like Santeria, and I was like, wait, that altar looks just like my altar. It's like, oh, well, duh, right? Because there was an easy way to mask it. What you see in places like Virginia and Maryland is you see, and you saw a more of a masking, right? More of a covert sort of practice of it, but everything from pouring libations out at a grave. That's like the most modern thing that you see people, you see hip hop videos and they're pouring things out. That is a West African practice. So I would argue that it has not disappeared. It absolutely was very prominent during the 17th century, during the 18th century, by the 19th century, with all of the sort of religious movements and the revivals and the sort of multi-generations then of attempted sort of Christianization, right, of these African people. You see a shift, but I would argue, so many of the practices of the Black church, if you will, are absolutely reflective of those West African, rituals. And so, you do see it fade out, but you just have to, once you know the roots, you can see it in everything. So I hope that was not too long of a winded answer, but I would say it's still here. It's just by the 19th century, it started to become very much muted. And I have students that, of African descent in my courses that, after they take my class, they're like, oh my goodness, I had no idea that these 43 things I do are actually West African. So, it's knowing about the roots there that helps.
Yeah, that's always fascinating in so many of the things across our cultures, whether it's African-American culture, Irish culture, whatever, those things that we do that we don't know why we do them or where they come from. So we have some experience, we're like, of course, how could that not be?
It's so true.
I know. Do we know anything about a correlation of iodine deficiency based on diets that became further removed from fresh seafood as plantations moved more inland?
That's an excellent question. I have not read anything on that, but I guarantee that was an issue. There was also trade, though. You do have evidence of some, shellfish and things being shipped up to play. I mean, you find evidence of people eating some of that, up west, but not too much. And I'm sure that was an issue. I mean, their health was horrible, absolutely horrible. And we were lucky, I'm lucky now here to talk about Stratford because we've got all the history of seafood, to sort of talk about and sort of weave into the narrative here and the dishes and things, but it absolutely would have changed as the more you go inland.
All right, here's a question about Stratford. Lynn, on her last visit to Stratford Hall 3 weeks ago, is well embedded in the basement of the house. Was this a finishing kitchen or for limited kinds of cooking rather than those kitchens you described as being separate, much less requiring a passageway to the house?
Did you miss the outside kitchen? We have 2 kitchens at Stratford. So yeah, no, that bums me out because we have this gigantic, huge kitchen that you saw a picture of outside of the house. That's our finishing kitchen, our warming kitchen. So the food would have been all the really heavy, laborious parts, like the chopping up of the hog, the roasting of the meats, that kind of stuff was happening in the outside kitchen. The food would then be brought into the warming kitchen. That's where it was plated on the really expensive china. That's where it would be garnished. That's where it would be, kept warm. So it was all hot at the same time.
All right. Also from Lynn, I'm making my way down my list here, everybody. I'm going to get to all you.
I've been in your position, so I got it.
Okay. The Middletown and Drayton Hall plantations along the Ashley River outside of Charleston, obviously Lynn is well traveled, provide examples of rice sluices for rice production. Do we have evidence of rice sluices? Hopefully I'm saying that right. Rice sluices being used anywhere in Tidewater, Virginia?
I don't know of any at all. The Georgia, South Carolina, that whole area is rice country. So, everything that they were eating had rice in it down there. Their bread even was rice flour. I mean, it's such a different, Virginians are more corn folks. Corn was more of the grain that was ground up into grits or whatever else, more so than rice. I mean, rice was served, but it was that thing you got from down south.
Before I go on to the next question, I would like to refer everyone to Michael Twitty's new book called Rice.
Exactly. There you go.
And there was a recipe, the phrase you used for jambalaya.
Jollof rice.
Yes, I mean, I love jambalaya. And I was going through the cookbook and I was just looking real fast because I just got it from Amazon.
Yeah.
I didn't know what that was, but now I do. Okay.
Oh, it's so good. It's so good.
Okay. Okay, what are your thoughts on the recent move away from African Americans depicted on food products?
If it was, my thing is this. I think if it's a Black-owned company, that's a very different thing. Who's making money off of the image of enslaved people, right? If it continues to be white folks that have been making money off that for a long time, that's super problematic. If an African-American company wants to open up something and start a food line and have, you know, whomever that might have been their ancestor or their mother or themselves on there, no problem at all. But I do think that the time has come where white people need to stop benefiting from using images of especially enslaved people. I think it's, you know, it's time to change that up. And you know, you can talk about it, you can give credit to them, but I think that the images also are so problematic. I mean, Aunt Jemima definitely, and they have all had a bit of a makeover over the last 100 years, but you look at the change over time and it's, you know, it's crazy.
This just sort of builds on that, but just to make sure that I've addressed it, and in case you have any, you know, further thoughts, it's another version of that. What would you, and this is one of my students, so what would you suggest to do with the current insensitive aesthetics of food products today, such as syrup and the, you know, Uncle Ben rice boxes?
I think they need to be remembered. You know, like I said in my talk, I don't even want to think about how many of those horrible Black Americana, you know, statues. I mean, I've got even the really expensive stuff. I mean, I could just sell it all online, but what I do with my stuff when I'm teaching is I use it to educate, because we can't forget, you know, I don't think everyone needs to be reminded of the history of racism in this country because they have to deal with it every day. But I do think that a lot of people, especially before this last summer, I mean, for me, I've been dedicated to, you know, really just, you know, attacking, you know, racism my entire life. I was born into a family that was very socially justice minded, racially mixed. And so for me, that's like part of my DNA. That's part of why I do what I do. But for the average, say, white person, you know, George Floyd was this whole moment. It was a watershed moment, you know, where a lot of people are like, this has been happening forever. You know, where have you been? So I feel like, this is a long way of saying this, but I feel like, you know, we need to really educate people about the history of race and racism in this country. And sometimes you need to have these images to say, actually, and my students are disgusted when I show them. I teach a course called Race in Cartoons, and we trace the history and idea of race from its conception through right now, right? And when you start watching those cartoons, the Tom and Jerry and the Disney stuff, I mean, that, talk about propaganda. You know, and the kids now have never seen that. And they're disgusted by what, you know, not really my generation, but everybody else grew up with as a normal thing. So I do think it's important to understand where we've been, where we are, and why we're here. So I think education with them is the best way to do it.
You know, I noticed just within the last month, it's a long story, but I suddenly have the Disney Channel. Well, I have the Disney Channel because of Hamilton is why I have the Disney. But I was looking at something else on Disney just to figure, anyway. So I was looking at the Jungle Book. There's a lot of, more than people, I'm of a certain generation where a lot of those early Disney classics, I just never saw for whatever reason. I should have, but I didn't. And I noticed going in that Disney now will put a disclaimer at the very beginning saying that there are racist depictions. They were wrong then, they're wrong now.
Okay.
They send something to there's I think a link where I found it. They reference it to a Disney site where they actually talk about this. And
okay, that's very responsible.
I was proud of them. I was proud of them. Okay.
And I think it's important too for people that did grow up, you know, I grew up watching the Jungle Book and I didn't realize how horrible it was until I was older, you know, and it's like that, the monkeys and all that hot mess. But, you know, again, that was normalized and it helped promote ideas of white supremacy during that period too. So that's great they're doing that.
Yeah, I mean, even the Aristocats, but we can go on.
Oh, and on and on.
Okay, the focus has been on the wealthy plantation properties. What would it have been like for the middling farmers and more lower classes? Would they have had enslaved labor? And that's from Diane.
Yeah, absolutely. So, you know, and even in doing my own historical research in my own family, you know, I had this very narrow idea of who I was based on a very narrow family tree, right? And if you think about it, you know, generations back during the period of enslavement, my goodness, there's hundreds of people that we have, if not thousands, in our family tree that we don't even know who they are. And in my personal process in doing this, I thought I was scot-free. I'm like, none of my ancestors owned enslaved people. I found very quickly, I mean, the Maryland folks, Oh my goodness. And they were not big planters. They were, you know, a family of 4 with 1 or 2 enslaved people. So, you know, absolutely. I mean, you have to understand too, if you were wealthy enough to have a farm, you were probably wealthy enough to have an enslaved person. And that was a very normal, common thing back then. You know, as disgusting as it was, that was what you did. And so, you know, yeah, I mean, there are definitely places where they didn't, but, you know, if you look at the numbers, the demographics of enslaved people in certain counties, and there's maps online. I mean, the digital humanities right now offers so much really hard data that helps kind of shed light on those smaller plantations, you know, even urban slavery. I mean, you know, look at places like Richmond, like Baltimore. You had, you know, you might have had a very wealthy or even like middling, you know, sort of size, you know, sort of class person with an enslaved person that was there, you know, doing everything in the house, butler, you know, coachman. If you didn't have a coach, maybe just, you know, whatever. I mean, you're going to have enslaved people everywhere. Again, I saw it in my own family tree with abundance, and it was shocking to me. And the more you look, the more you find out.
Yeah, I think about early on in Maryland's history when everything was congregated around the Bay in Southern Maryland and the Eastern Shore, and you had these small farms, I'm not even going to necessarily call them plantations, where, you know, the guy didn't even have a family. You know, he wasn't doing tobacco on his own. You know, he wasn't doing it. Okay. Deanna, I would love to hear thoughts about interpreting kitchen spaces for children's tours, particularly elementary ages.
Absolutely. So we are right now in the process of redoing our school group programs. And I'm actually, funny enough, I am working, I am the consultant working at the governor's mansion and the kitchen project here in Virginia. I'm working with Pamela Northam, the governor's wife, and we are doing just that. We're actually talking about how to interpret those kitchens, the governor's mansion kitchen, Stratford Hall. And I think that, you know, 2 things. One is I don't think it's ever too early to talk about the history of enslavement. I think that there's ways to do it that's tactful. There's ways to do it that children can handle. I mean, think about fairy tales and, you know, my God, like even Snow White or, you know, Hansel and Gretel. I mean, they got eaten up in the woods. Like, kids can handle these sort of fantastical stories. They can handle a little bit of history. And so my approach to doing that is, one, definitely talk about what it meant to be enslaved, what it meant to be free, how that correlated with race, and then talk about the food and the contributions, because kids at some point, and I'm not an elementary school teacher, so forgive me if I'm thinking wrongly on this, but from my experience, you know, kids will definitely take in some information, but you want to leave them with something that's not just depressing. So when you start talking about food is the common, you know, sort of a denominator with all humans, right? And I feel like that's why kitchens are the ultimate space to talk about issues of race and space and power in this country, because food will bring people to the table that would never, ever attend a lecture on slavery, never visit a plantation site. So in some ways, these school groups are kind of like the general public, like they're forced to go there. So what are you going to leave them with? So I think talking about that last slide, talking about the different ingredients that were brought over from West Africa, I think that's a really important thing to sort of instill in them. Let them know when they leave that peanuts, not just peanut butter, you know, but peanuts came from West Africa. Like, and think about all the ways in which they eat peanuts. How are those things cooked? Food as memory. So I think that there's ways to do it through food and some very clearly put factual information on what it meant to be enslaved and free in that space. Did it freeze? Did it freeze? What happened? Was I blabbing onto myself?
Yeah, I think we froze completely for a moment, but I think we're okay.
Okay.
So we'll go back to questions real quick.
Mary, you're muted, Mary.
I got it, Steph. Thank you. All right, Kelly, you were in the midst of the discussion about elementary school kids.
Okay, yeah. So, you know, I don't know what you all heard or not heard, but I do think it's important to lay out some very basic bits about slavery, you know, the numbers, even what it meant to be enslaved, what it meant to be free. And then really focusing on some of the cultural stuff, the food, the ways in which things were cooked, the ingredients, the recipes. I think that together is a nice way to introduce that to those kids. As they get older, they can hear more about the nuance and the power and the poison and all that.
Next question. Exactly. And also, I mean, as you're saying about cooking, everyone eats, everyone watches people cook usually. Not everyone raises tobacco or grows sugar.
Yep.
So it makes it more. Okay, we're going to have to move to Carrie asking the questions because my chat is completely gone now.
Oh no.
After the explosion. So I give you Carrie.
Hi, Carrie.
Hey, so thanks for your patience with us, everyone. I don't know what happened. I don't know if it was the county Wi-Fi shut down or what, but Mary, can you turn down for 1 second? I did. Okay. So the next question we have is kind of about the idea of gender and what kinds of gender segregation in those who worked as cooks, male enslaved people or women. So you kind of highlighted both. Can you talk a little bit about that and what we see overall?
Yeah, absolutely. So what I did notice is that the earlier groups of enslaved cooks were predominantly men. So the ones coming over and being put into the kitchen during the 17th century and early 18th century were vast majority were enslaved men. As again, the women start coming in more, and then that becomes sort of a weird gendered thing. And I'm talking about not only enslaved women, but also the white ladies coming in. You see a shift towards more of a balance between men and women. In my research, by the 19th century, you still have a fair amount of enslaved men cooking, but majority women by the 19th century in those spaces.
Great, thank you for that.
You're welcome.
And then Katie had a question. She said you were talking about dismantling the Jim Crow era interpretation of enslaved history and not being afraid to talk about it in lack of hard evidence and maybe how we know exactly who was in the kitchen. Like here at Rose Hill, we've been doing a lot of our history of looking at the enslaved people, and we know some names, but we don't necessarily know what they were doing on the property. So in looking at that hard evidence of knowing exactly who was where, what are some ways that you can reinterpret that history?
I'm sorry, that was really loud.
What are some ways that you can reinterpret that history respectfully in the lack of that definite?
I'm sorry, I'm having a really hard time hearing you.
Yeah, well, Carrie was asking how to interpret that history respectfully, particularly with a lack of documentation. I'd also like at this point in time mention what Rose from Arch is mentioning is that it's important to have African Americans input when you talk about what it means when speaking about the experience of African Americans.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So I work with a large group of consultants here at Stratford Hall. We do a lot of, we've had that whole foodways program that we did this last fall and over the winter, where we have Cheney McKnight, Dontavius Williams, Nicole Moore. They're here. They're constantly providing input. I also at Stratford Hall, the first thing I did when I got here was establish an African American advisory group. So they are part of every decision and every interpretation that is made here. And also a little bit about myself as well. I was trained in Black Studies. All of my professors have been of African descent, and I continue to work with them and other scholars. So I'm absolutely aware of the importance of that, and I bring that with me as I move forward on everything that I do. And so as far as and I think that ties into that first comment too, so thinking about the ways in which to do this respectfully, I think that not everyone is going to be capable to just sort of jump in, right, and sort of develop this sort of African-American historical narrative on a site. You have to spend time in the archives. You have to spend time reading. It's important to understand the history, and also to, as you pointed out as well, talk to descendants, have them as part of the conversation, and not just sort of, expecting that somehow, you're doing it right because you read some books. And so I think it needs to be a collective effort. And, even then you might run into some bumps, but I think that, really thinking about these spaces, bringing those people into those spaces is such an important thing to do, but you have to do it responsibly. So thank you for bringing that up, Rose.
Yeah, without a doubt. And I know that several sites here in Frederick are attempting to locate descendants, which is no easy task, to say the least.
It's not.
have found.
And I have to say too, working at the birthplace of Robert E. Lee, there was a lot of, hesitancy, as you can imagine, in engaging with this new direction that we're going in. But the first year I was here, we had the African American Advisory Committee and myself and my staff here planned our first Juneteenth commemoration. And we're going to continue to, a lot of our programming has been around the African American experience here on site. And it's been phenomenal, not just for the site in general, because everybody needs to know this, but I think that it's really important for the descendants too to have a voice here and feel a sense of power on the site. And that's happening through time.
Yeah, without a doubt. And a conversation that we're hoping to have a little bit later, and you probably have moved on to better things than us at that point in time, is how to get that for sites that are predominantly white or have been interpreted white and have white staff. How do we pull in the voice? And generally it's been working with our African American group. Okay, on to the next question that I still have. Carrie will go back because there were like 14 questions before the computer exploded. Maybe that's why.
I think there's 40 or just a bunch. I don't know where they are, 40, but go ahead, 40. Sorry.
Okay, so here we go. How did the food move from food beloved by enslaved people to remind them of their heritage to the table of the plantation owner?
So, it was simply put, the enslaved cooks were cooking it. And I can tell you right now, having tasted so many of the recipes that were cooked back then, they smell amazing. It just, I guarantee that it was one taste or one smell. So one of the things that I noticed too in my research is that some of the enslaved folks from the field quarters were sometimes tapped and brought up into the kitchen. And, I'm assuming and, presuming that possibly some of them were well-known cooks in the quarter and therefore then brought back up to the house. But when you have somebody who's enslaved of African descent in that kitchen and they're cooking food for the big house and also for their own in the kitchen space, at some point, the mistress of the house or someone's going to come down there and see and ask questions and taste it. And honestly, having tasted all the different kinds of food from the 18th century, my absolute favorite flavor-wise and everything is the food of the African diaspora. So I don't think, I know it didn't take long for that food to end up on those tables.
I know what little I know about British cuisine and its level of what to me is very bland. I can see that. And I know it's not quite the same correlation, but like New Orleans is one of my favorite places in the whole world. And I just like eat my way through New Orleans. And so much of that food comes from that heritage, obviously.
And you think about New Orleans too, with the Haitian Revolution and all of the, the Afro-Haitian people coming up and the French influences and the Native American influences. That's one of those cultural spaces that has got some pretty strong culinary hitters in the mix.
Yeah, fabulous. Okay, we think we got all the questions. Again, everyone, sorry for the technology issues. Thank you, Kelly, for sticking with us during that. Thank you, everyone, for sticking there with us. If anyone has a question that has not been addressed, if you can type it in really fast, and we'll just take a second to make sure that nobody's there. In the meanwhile, I'd like to thank you so much, Kelly, for coming out. This has been fabulous. You may not have seen the chat, but many people are saying how wonderful this presentation was, and we're so thankful to have had you with us. Here's another one saying thank you so much. Anybody else got any? Feel free to thank as much as you want. Look, here's more thanks are coming through. But any other questions?
I do want to extend a serious invitation to any of you that want to come down to Stratford Hall. Since coming here in 2018, I've completely changed the interpretation. We now start our tour in the kitchen and we start talking about the enslaved African and African Americans for the first 30 minutes of the tour before we even start talking about the Lees. I have elevated their stories to be on the same tier as the Lee family. I have a new exhibit happening right now as well that is doing the same exact thing with the artifacts of the enslaved and the artifacts of the Lees. They're Lees, they're all in the same space. And I've got a beautiful portrait gallery on one side of the wall where next to every single Lee lady, there is a gold frame with a silhouette traced from the descendants of the African and African Americans that were here to represent how essential and important those African women were. So there's a lot of things that we're doing here on site. I welcome any of you and all of you. I will absolutely comp your tickets and you can bring a bunch of people if you want to. I would love to have you on site and show you what we're doing here and show off the site. So thank you all.
Yeah, we have talked at various times, and Liz mentions this as well, about having like a Docent day away, a field trip. If we're able to make that happen, you'll be the first place we come to. I do have one final question based on what you were just talking about. And of course, you know, we can't let one person obviously does not represent an entire race by any stretch of the imagination.
Yes.
But when I worked at a previous job, my supervisor was African-American, and it was right when Williamsburg was starting to interpret their slave heritage. And he was so very much against it and so very much opposed to why. Now, he was also not a historian. He was a public, well, he wasn't even it was a public health library. So he came from a different background, obviously. But do you ever get that pushback where people are saying, you know, why are you telling this story? Not from white people, I mean from Black people.
Yeah.
You know,
no,
telling the story.
Absolutely. So I was the vice president of the African American history in Lynchburg for a few years. And, you know, I'm very used to being like that one sort of, you know, European woman, like in the midst of, you know, like a whole like committee or staff of African Americans. And so there was, you know, it was a very interesting thing when I started working there, because there was about a third of the elders there wanted nothing to do with an exhibit on slavery that was being promoted. And, you know, sort of sitting there, and, you know, it was interesting to me because, you know, watching, it was dozens of people sit and have this conversation where you literally had like two very clear camps, right? One of saying like, that was so painful, no one wants to talk about that. And that generation of folks got that Jim Crow era history, right? That really doesn't talk about the rich cultural heritage and history of those enslaved Africans. They don't talk about the poisoning and the revolutions and Nat Turner and Haiti. They don't talk about the contributions of enslaved folks to this country. And so who would want to talk about the gloom and doom of enslavement? So I totally understand that. Then you have sort of the rest of the 2/3 of the group and the staff and the board that felt very strongly about telling these stories. So you do still see that. I've met docents of African descent that feel very uncomfortable talking about this stuff, and that's their right to not want to do it. I mean, we can't presume too that every single person of African descent is going to be excited about talking about this or even wants to talk about it. They have the right to not be interested. And so I think that's an important thing to think about as well.
Yeah, right. Yes, thank you, particularly for our white docents who are in our crowd, who may be getting that pushback during a tour when they also don't have their museum manager right behind them offering sage advice on how to address that. So thank you so much. Okay, I think we are done with this part of it. Thank you so much, Kelly. Again, I cannot thank you enough for coming out. We will see if we can bring us all down at some point in time when we can all get together closer. And again, thank you so much. And we're looking forward to having you back after your cookbook or after your sugar book or before both.
Or something else, right? Thank you so much. And I hope any of you, please email me if you want to visit. It's definitely an important site to see.
Okay, fabulous. And if anyone has any trouble finding Kelly's email or having any other questions and having trouble getting directly to Kelly, don't hesitate to get to me or Carrie. Thank you so much, Kelly. Everybody, we're having a very brief break. Actually, you have a 10-minute break. So quickly run to the ladies' room and the gentleman's room or get a snack. But we'd love to see you back at 12:15. Thank you, everyone. And thank you, Kelly.